For centuries, behind locked doors and sealed vaults, the Vatican has guarded truths the world was never meant to see. Thick stone walls rise like a fortress against time itself, holding within them stories that were rewritten, relics that were hidden, and names that were quietly erased. You stand before those doors now, not as a pilgrim, not as a believer, but as someone who wants to know why. They say knowledge is power, but here, knowledge is danger. It's the kind of power that gets buried beneath marble floors and sealed under wax. Somewhere in those catacombs lies a version of history the world was told to forget. Forget what Hollywood taught you. There are no heroic archaeologists here, no neat conclusions. Just dust, silence, and 1,000 locked drawers filled with questions. You can almost hear the whisper of parchment as ancient scrolls breathe beneath layers of decay. Latin prayers murmur through the halls, half to the saints, half to the secrets. Every corridor feels alive, not with faith, but with fear of what faith once destroyed. The Vatican Archives stretch for over 85 kilometers, a labyrinth of records dating back more than a millennium. Scholars call it a treasure of history. Others call it a vault of censorship. Only a handful of people are allowed to wander its aisles, and even fewer are allowed to speak about what they find. Officially, the archives are open for study. In practice, only fragments ever see daylight. A letter from a forgotten pope. A decree written in ink made from ash. A burned corner of a book that once dared to question the shape of the universe. You think of how history works, how winners write it, how losers vanish. How faith, for all its light, casts very long shadows. Maybe some secrets were hidden to protect the faithful. Maybe some were hidden to protect the powerful. The line between those two reasons is thinner than a strand of angel hair. As you walk further down the imaginary corridor, you notice the dust motes hanging in the light from a small stained glass window. It paints the air red, like blood suspended midair. The temperature drops, and suddenly, the silence feels heavy, like it's pressing against your skin. Somewhere beyond that silence lies a truth that never made it into the Sunday sermon. There are whispers of banned manuscripts that contradicted Genesis, of maps that charted lands before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing, of astronomers forced to swear that the earth stood still when they knew it spun beneath their feet. And for every whisper, there's a warning. Some things are better left unread. But tonight, you're not here to pray. You're here to read between the lines. Each of the 40 truths we'll uncover is a small piece of a much larger picture, fragments of a world edited by faith, rewritten by fear, and archived by those who decided which version of history should survive. Some of what follows is verified fact. Some is legend, speculation, or the kind of story that survives because it feels true, even when no one can prove it. You'll have to decide which is which, just like every scholar who ever stood before those locked Vatican doors. So take a breath. Dim the lights. Imagine the faint smell of burning candle wax and the rustle of pages that have waited 600 years to be opened. Because the first truth lies beyond that door. And once you start reading, you might understand why it was locked in the first place. The door creaks open, and the first thing that greets you isn't holiness. It's dust. It coats everything. The wooden shelves, the bronze locks, the air itself. You step inside, and it feels less like entering a sanctuary and more like breaking into a tomb. Somewhere in this endless maze, the past has been buried alive. They say the church once collected every manuscript it could, not to preserve them, but to decide which ones deserved to exist. Some were burned for heresy, some quietly rewritten, and some simply vanished. You find a scrap of parchment lying half-curled on a desk, its ink faded but still legible. It speaks of stars, of how the heavens might move not around the earth, but around something far greater, unseen. The name in the margin is familiar, Giordano Bruno. He believed the universe was infinite, filled with countless worlds like ours. For that he burned alive in Rome, 1600. Not because he was wrong, but because he was early. And somewhere in these archives, you imagine there's a letter, maybe from a frightened monk, begging that Bruno's works be locked away instead of destroyed. A compromise between faith and curiosity. But the fire won that argument. It usually does. You move deeper where the air grows colder. A faint light flickers. Maybe a candle left too long, maybe your imagination. In a glass case lies a stack of sealed documents, labeled only in Latin. The handwriting is deliberate, almost nervous. You can make out the words, Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books. It existed for over 4 centuries. A catalogue of every idea the Church thought too dangerous for the public to read. The irony? The list itself became a bestseller. Names fill the pages like a cemetery of thought: Galileo, Copernicus, Descartes. Even writers like Voltaire and Pascal, whose only crime was asking the wrong questions out loud. You can almost hear their arguments echo through time, men staring through telescopes or scribbling equations, only to have their discoveries filed under heresy. One volume catches your eye, bound in leather, edges singed, title rubbed away. You turn it over and realize it's written in a language older than Latin. Greek? No, Aramaic. The script of prophets. The Church once had entire teams devoted to translating these ancient texts, then deciding which passages to clarify for public comfort. Some words were softened. Others were erased. A few were never translated at all. You picture a scribe by candlelight, pausing over a verse that says too much, maybe about women or creation, or something divine that doesn't fit doctrine. He dips his quill, scratches through the line, and history shifts by one quiet stroke. That's how knowledge disappears. Not in flames, but in ink. In a corner of the room stands a cabinet marked Cosmologia. Inside, you find a handful of sketches, spheres, lines, concentric circles labeled Terra, Luna, Sol. One looks different. The sun in the center, the earth circling it. Someone has written beside it, dangerous. Centuries later, school children would learn that diagram as fact. But in this room, it was once a death sentence. You start to notice a pattern. Each piece of lost knowledge shares the same fingerprints. Brilliance met with fear. Discovery punished for daring to outshine faith. And yet, even here, buried under centuries of secrecy, those ideas refused to die. They leaked out through whispers, smuggled copies, heretical scholars hiding pages beneath false bindings. Truth is stubborn like that. You imagine one of those forbidden books escaping this place, carried by a monk who couldn't bear to see it burn. He hides it under his robe, slips through the corridors at night, and disappears into the city. That single act of defiance keeps a piece of the world alive. You wonder how many other worlds were lost because no one did the same. The room grows still again. The dust settles. And for a moment, it feels like the air itself is waiting for you to turn another page, to find the next secret, the next idea that history tried to forget. Because knowledge isn't always light. Sometimes it's the thing you're told never to touch. And somewhere deeper in this labyrinth, behind thicker locks and older walls, lie the things you were never supposed to read at all. You leave the scriptorium behind and descend the narrow staircase that winds beneath the Vatican. The air grows damp, and the faint scent of candle wax gives way to stone and earth. Down here, light feels like an intruder. It's quiet, but not the peaceful kind. The kind that hums in your ears, thick and uneasy. Most visitors never see this part. They stop at the polished basilicas, the marble saints, the painted ceilings, beauty meant to lift your gaze upward. But beneath all that, history runs downward, into catacombs and crypts layered like the pages of a buried book. Somewhere beneath your feet lies the supposed tomb of St. Peter himself. A fisherman turned apostle, turned foundation of the church. You imagine the centuries of pilgrims kneeling above him, never realizing that beneath the altar, excavations have revealed something strange. Bones that don't all belong to one man. Some too young, some too old. A collection of faith, pieced together like a reliquary puzzle. But here's the uncomfortable part. For every relic displayed under glass, there are a dozen locked away from view. Skulls labeled with saints' names that appear in no scripture. Fragments of wood claimed to be from the true cross. More wood than could build a ship, yet each splinter treated as holy. Faith and forgery have always been close friends. You reach a corridor where the walls narrow and the air cools. A gate of iron bars blocks your path, and beyond it, a small room glows faintly. Inside, relic boxes, small gilded coffers covered in dust. Some are labeled in Latin, others in Greek, and some bear no writing at all. One box catches your attention. Its seal is broken. Inside rests a cloth, yellowed and fragile, a face faintly visible in the weave. For centuries, people have whispered of the Veil of Veronica, a relic said to bear the image of Christ's face. There are at least 6 authentic ones scattered across Europe, each defended as the true one. You think about how faith multiplies. One miracle becomes many, each claimed by a different cathedral, each drawing its own pilgrims. A divine economy. Somewhere deeper still, behind walls few have entered, lie the bones of those the Church prefers not to name. Pagan priests, ancient philosophers, and early Christians who didn't make it into the canon. Their remains were moved, hidden, reclassified. History's lost congregation. And beneath them all, the catacombs. Kilometers of graves carved into soft tufa stone, their ceilings blackened with smoke from oil lamps long extinguished. Symbols still cling to the walls. Fish, anchors, circles, cryptic letters. The earliest Christian graffiti, or perhaps something older. Whispers speak of secret chambers, sealed doors with no records, crypts discovered and reburied. A few archaeologists once claimed to have found an underground temple, pre-Christian, adapted by early followers into a sanctuary. Their report was quietly filed away. Some things, apparently, are better left beneath the earth. You stop for a moment and listen. The walls seem to breathe. Drops of water echo from somewhere unseen. It's strange how much the Church hides underground. Bones, scrolls, relics, records. Maybe heaven was always meant to be above, but the truth seems to prefer the dark. You think of a story, a rumor, really, of a hidden vault beneath the Apostolic Palace. Inside, they say, rests a collection of relics deemed too powerful or too controversial for display, an ossuary of unverified saints, artifacts from pre-Christian cults, fragments of texts written in languages no one's dared translate. Officially, it doesn't exist. But unofficially, almost everyone here has heard of it. You can almost imagine it, a single corridor, cold and silent, lined with locked glass cases. Inside each, a relic that could rewrite a sermon or ignite another reformation. A tooth said to belong to John the Baptist. A vial of dark liquid marked only sanguis. A tablet engraved with symbols no scholar has matched to any known alphabet. And somewhere among them, a small wooden box with a red wax seal. No label. No record. No key. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. You turn back toward the stairway. The relics remain in their shadows, guarded not by guards, but by silence. Up above, tourists shuffle through marble halls, their footsteps echoing faintly, unaware that beneath their prayers lie the bones of 1,000 forgotten stories. And as you climb, you can't help but think, maybe the past isn't lost at all. Maybe it's just buried deep enough to feel holy. You emerge from the catacombs into a long corridor of shelves and filing drawers. The air tastes of iron and old incense. Somewhere far above, church bells echo, but down here time has stopped. What survives in this room isn't faith, it's editing. You open a drawer and find names written in ink so pale it looks like regret. Whole families, entire sects, crossed out with a single line. History redacted. 1,000 years ago, the Church's scribes worked night after night copying the same stories. Every gospel had to agree, every miracle had to match. The ones that didn't, those were quietly corrected. The Gospel of Mary. The Gospel of Thomas. Even a fragment called the Gospel of the Egyptians. Once they were read aloud in secret gatherings, now their pages sleep in museum vaults or here, misfiled under Apocrypha. You picture a monk hesitating over one of those pages, words that say salvation comes from knowledge, not obedience. He sighs, shakes his head, and slides it into the fire. The flame is the cleanest editor of all. But ashes travel. Bits of those texts survived, quoted in letters, whispered in monasteries, copied by mistake. The Church could burn books, not thoughts. Thoughts breed in silence. You pull another folder, the Cathars. Southern France, 13th century. They believed the material world was corrupt, that true faith meant rejecting power and wealth. They refused to pay tithes. They read the Bible themselves. For that, an army was sent. Entire towns wiped away under banners embroidered with crosses. The official chronicle called it a crusade. The survivors called it something else, extinction. A pattern begins to show through the dust. When belief threatened hierarchy, it was erased. When it served it, canonized. History isn't written by victors, it's copied by them. On a nearby table lies a cracked wax seal stamped with a papal crest. Inside, a faded letter from the 15th century. It orders the re-evaluation of several saints whose miracles proved problematic. Meaning, they didn't happen where or how they were supposed to. Some saints were quietly demoted, others forgotten altogether. Even holiness has a quality control department. You remember that old story of Hypatia, the philosopher of Alexandria. Brilliant, rational, inconvenient. Torn apart by a mob, her library burned. Later historians debated whether it was zeal or politics. The result was the same, a mind removed from memory. Then there's the legend of Pope Joan, a woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man, rose through the clergy, and even reigned for 2 years before being discovered. Most scholars dismiss it as myth, yet medieval art kept slipping her into the margins. Tiny figures, a crown, a woman's face half hidden under a hood. If it wasn't true, it was certainly Firetto B. You run your fingers across a line of ledgers labeled conversion accounts. Here lie the rewritten genealogies of entire nations. Norse gods baptized into saints, Celtic festivals renamed as Christian feasts. Samhain became All Saints' Eve. Bridget became Saint Bridget. The transformation is so neat you almost admire it. History cleaned up for polite company. It hits you how fragile memory really is. One decree, one translation, and a civilization tilts in another direction. Maybe that's why these drawers are so heavy, they're full of alternate timelines. You imagine what would happen if everything in this room were released. Historians would argue. Believers would panic. Maybe the church would shrug. Centuries have a way of softening guilt. Still, the truth would crawl out, blinking, like something that hasn't seen light since parchment was a luxury. At the far end of the corridor, a locked cabinet hums faintly with the draft of hidden air. Inside, rumors say, are letters from priests who doubted, records of secret trials, even testimonies of miracles that were too strange to endorse. Angels that didn't behave like angels. Visions that contradicted doctrine. Faith isn't just belief, it's brand management. You stand there a while, surrounded by the ghosts of red ink and half-burned pages. You start to realize that the real miracle isn't resurrection, it's survival through censorship. Above you, the bells ring again, muffled but insistent, as if time is calling you back to the surface. You close the drawer gently. The erased names stay where they are, but for a moment, they feel remembered. You whisper an apology to no one in particular, then turn toward the stairs. Because the next stories waiting in the dark aren't about what the church forgot. They're about what it condemned on purpose. The staircase curls upward into a hall lined with portraits. Cardinals, scholars, men who look more like judges than saints. Their painted eyes follow you as you walk, each gaze saying the same thing. Be careful what you believe. You've entered the age of fear disguised as faith. Imagine Europe in the late Middle Ages, villages wrapped in fog, churches ringing bells not for prayer but for warning. The world was supposed to be simple, heaven above, hell below, and a priest to explain the rules in between. Anyone who asked for a second opinion risked becoming a cautionary tale. You pause beside a portrait of a man with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. He looks ordinary enough, until you notice the scorch marks painted at the edges of his robes. His name was Jan Hus, a Czech priest who preached that salvation didn't need a price tag. The church disagreed. They promised him safe conduct to a council, then tied him to a stake instead. The ashes of his sermons drifted across the Rhine like gray snow. A few shelves away, there's a book bound in cracked leather, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. Published in 1487, it became Europe's second best-selling manual, right after the Bible. Its authors claimed that women, especially midwives and widows, were natural vessels for the devil. For 2 centuries, the text justified a firestorm of trials, confessions, and executions. They called it purification. It looked a lot like panic. You trace the edge of the page and wonder how belief can turn to fear so quickly. Maybe because fear feels righteous when you give it a halo. Across the room sits another relic, a telescope, small and tarnished, its lens cracked. Beside it, a note in Latin signed by Galileo Galilei. He spent his final years under house arrest, his greatest sin being mathematics. He proved the planets moved, and for that he was forced to kneel and swear he was wrong. Legend says that as he rose, he whispered, "E se move," and yet it moves. Even under oath, the universe refused to stop spinning. Further down the corridor, you find a collection of burned pages pressed between glass. The fragments belong to a woman named Marguerite Porete, a mystic who wrote about divine love so pure that it made priests irrelevant. She was burned in Paris in 1310, accused of infecting souls with freedom. Her book was banned, then copied in secret by those she inspired. Every few centuries someone reprints it. It keeps surviving like a weed through stone. You can almost hear her voice, soft and defiant. The soul has no need of permission to love God. The walls seem to close in, heavy with stories of people who mistook curiosity for sin. The pattern repeats: knowledge, silence, fire. Over and over, until even the memory of dissent feels dangerous to touch. Yet the church was never a monolith. For every inquisitor, there was a monk copying Arabic science. For every executioner, a nun hiding a heretic's notes. In the shadows of dogma, small revolutions kept flickering. You stop before a heavy iron chest embossed with strange symbols. Its latch is rusted but locked. The tag reads Templum Inquisitio. Inside, they say, lie the confessions of the Knights Templar, one of the church's most dramatic implosions. Once heroes of crusade, later accused of blasphemy, idol worship, and worse. Historians now suspect their real crime was being rich enough to lend money to kings. Faith has always had a complicated relationship with debt. The silence feels thick again, as if the air itself remembers screams. It's easy to imagine torches flickering, parchment curling in the heat, and the sound of chains clinking as another thinker is led away. Yet somewhere inside those moments, belief still survived. Smaller, humbler, and harder to control. That's the strange thing about forbidden ideas. Once named, they never truly disappear. They hide in whispers, in margins, in the stubborn human habit of wondering why. You glance once more at the portraits on the wall. Their painted eyes seem less stern now, more tired, as if they know the cost of protecting certainty. Outside, thunder rolls over Rome. You feel the vibration through the stones beneath your feet, like a reminder that even the holiest walls crack with time. And just as you turn to leave, the candle beside you flickers, its flame bending toward a door half hidden behind a tapestry. Another passage. Another secret. Because faith may burn what it fears, but it always leaves ashes, and ashes have a way of marking the trail. You push through the hidden door and step into a world that looks newer but feels no less secret. Fluorescent lights hum where candlelight once flickered. The marble is polished, the guards wear suits, and the vault doors have digital locks. Even secrecy has upgraded. Welcome to the modern Vatican, the same empire of silence, just wearing better shoes. You wander past glass walls that gleam like confessionals for machines. Somewhere beyond them lie the archives that survived the 20th century, reorganized but never truly opened. Historians still file polite requests to read certain documents and still wait, sometimes decades, for a reply that never comes. The bureaucracy of mystery. One hallway leads to a chamber filled with ledgers. Thick volumes bound in green leather, stamped Istituto per l'Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. The Vatican Bank. It sounds noble, almost pastoral, until you flip through the pages and find numbers instead of prayers. Balances. Transfers. Code names. The church calls it stewardship, economists call it opacity. In the 1980s, a banker named Roberto Calvi was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets were stuffed with bricks, his ties to the Vatican whispered but never proven. The official story said suicide. The newspapers preferred murder. Somewhere in these archives, there's a folder labeled Calvi. No one is allowed to see it. You pass a security door marked Reserved Section. Behind it, they say, lie the files of the Holy Office, the modern descendant of the Inquisition. Rebranded, of course. Public relations matters even to eternity. Reports of exorcisms, doctrinal investigations, letters from priests who saw too much. The Church stopped burning heretics long ago, now it simply reassigns them. The light flickers, and for a moment, the polished floor reflects the ghost of a candlelit dungeon. Different century, same shadow. A few rooms down, you find a climate-controlled chamber of microfilm reels. Every reel labeled by year, each containing the daily correspondence of popes, nuncios, and cardinals. Scholars are allowed to view documents up to 75 years old. After that, the shutters close. The reason is always the same: to protect the privacy of the living. A gentle phrase that covers a multitude of sins. You stop at one reel dated 1942. The year the world was burning. The Vatican declared neutrality while trains rolled toward silence. Some letters from that period have been released. Enough to start debates, never enough to end them. The rest remain locked, perhaps waiting for a future less easily scandalized. Further along, another sealed case bears the label Fatima, Private. Inside are the original letters describing the visions of 3 Portuguese children in 1917. They claimed the Virgin revealed 3 secrets about the fate of humanity. 2 were made public. The third was withheld for decades, feeding rumors of apocalypse, papal death, or worse. When it was finally released in 2000, it spoke vaguely of suffering and faith. Many doubted it was the real one. Maybe because truth rarely arrives in press releases. You take a breath. The air feels artificial, filtered, and dry. Yet underneath the hum of climate control, you can almost hear the heartbeat of something older, the same instinct that built catacombs and locked drawers. Protect knowledge or hide it. The difference depends on who's reading. In a corner stands a plain wooden crate, oddly out of place among the steel cabinets. Its tag reads, Archivio Segreto, Miscellaneous. Someone has scrawled a note on the side, do not destroy. You imagine the archivist who wrote it, torn between obedience and curiosity. Inside might be nothing, a misfiled receipt, an old chalice. Or perhaps something that should have stayed a rumor. Outside, the bells begin to toll again. You realize they sound the same as they did 500 years ago. The technology changes, the rituals don't. You glance back down the hall. Every locked door seems to breathe. Every light hums like a secret half-told. The Vatican has always been good at one thing, turning mystery into architecture. And somewhere behind those steel vaults, in a file marked, restricted until further notice, the next truth waits patiently, dustless, silent, unforgotten. Because in the end, the Church learned that you don't have to burn a book to hide it. You just have to keep it closed long enough for everyone to stop asking. You climb the last flight of stairs. The air grows warmer, the ceiling lower, until the corridor ends at a wooden door carved with vines and wings. It isn't locked. Just waiting. Inside, the room is small, bare walls, a single desk, and a chair positioned beneath a stained glass window. The glass spills color across the floor like liquid fire. Red, gold, and deep blue, the holy trinity of secrecy. You realize this is not an archive at all. It's a mirror. 4 hours, you've been chasing lost pages, forbidden books, burned heretics, and sealed vaults. Every secret seemed to point somewhere higher, like steps leading to a final revelation. But standing here, you start to suspect the truth was never buried under the Vatican. It's built into it. Maybe that's the real genius of the Church, hiding truth in plain sight. Every painting, every ritual, every line of scripture is a code written in art and repetition. A story retold until it stops sounding like a question. You look around. On the desk lies a single object, a key. Old brass, green with age. Beside it, a parchment folded once, sealed with wax that has long since cracked. You hesitate, then open it. Inside, only a few words written in Latin, Veritas servat fidem. Truth preserves faith. It sounds noble, but you can't help hearing the echo of another meaning. Sometimes faith survives only by guarding truth too tightly. You think back to the manuscripts buried under dust, the bones mislabeled for devotion, the philosophers who burned for asking the wrong questions. Each fragment you found was part of a pattern, a network of choices, deliberate and careful, shaping what humanity would be allowed to remember. Maybe the Vatican didn't hide these truths to deceive. Maybe it hid them to keep the world from tearing itself apart. Power always justifies itself that way. It's the same logic as the priest who spares his flock from dangerous scripture, or the scientist who withholds an experiment too potent for peace. Not yet, they say. The world isn't ready. But the world rarely is. The sunlight through the stained glass shifts, throwing a different color across the room. You notice faint etchings on the wall, names, dates, short prayers in half-erased ink. They're the fingerprints of centuries of hands that guarded, copied, or concealed the past. People who believed they were protecting something holy. Maybe they were. You trace one line with your fingertip. The Latin is faded, but you recognize the word lux, light. The one thing the Vatican both worships and fears. A strange thought settles over you. What if secrecy itself was the Church's greatest invention? Not to hide evil, but to create awe. To make truth feel unreachable, so belief could remain pure. Mystery, after all, is the oxygen of faith. Without it, divinity starts looking like administration. Outside, thunder rumbles. The stained glass trembles slightly in its frame. The red light deepens to something almost bloody. You close the parchment and place it back on the desk. The key glints in the shifting light, as if daring you to take it. But you don't. Maybe because you already understand what it unlocks. The final secret isn't a relic, or a file, or a vault. It's the simple fact that truth and power can't exist without each other. One creates, the other conceals. They need the tension to survive. You step back toward the door. Behind you, the colors on the floor fade as the clouds move across the sun. The room returns to its ordinary gray. Holy, mundane, unchanged. Somewhere deep beneath your feet, the archives keep humming. Somewhere above, the bells prepare to ring the hour. The Vatican remains what it has always been, a cathedral built on paradox. Sanctuary and vault. Faith and fear. Revelation and restraint. You pause at the threshold and glance back one last time. Maybe the truth isn't missing. Maybe it was never meant for us to find. The bells begin to ring again. Slow, deliberate, as if each chime is counting something down. The sound spills through the narrow corridors, seeps into the stones, and vibrates the dust that has gathered since the 1st century of Rome. The Vatican has heard this same song for almost 2,000 years. Nothing changes. Only the listeners do. You step outside. The air is warm, heavy with the smell of rain that hasn't yet fallen. Tourists drift across St. Peter's Square like ghosts who never realized they died centuries ago. Cameras click. Laughter echoes off the marble. No one looks up at the sky. No one wonders what the bells are really marking. You take a seat on one of the cold stone benches. The dome towers above you, enormous and indifferent. The world believes it knows this place, a palace of light, the home of saints. But you've seen what hides beneath the marble. The rooms without names. The shelves that hum with forbidden history. And it makes you wonder, maybe heaven has always been an archive with better branding. You close your eyes. The sounds of the city fade. Only the bells remain. For a moment, you imagine that every toll marks one of the truths buried under this city. 40 rings for 40 forgotten stories. You've heard only fragments, but that's all history ever gives us, pieces stitched together by faith and imagination. Sometimes the stitching holds. Sometimes it bleeds. You think about the people who once carried those secrets. Monks bent over parchment until their eyes failed, archivists who copied heretical letters in secret before burning the originals, cardinals who whispered confessions in Latin knowing no one would ever translate them. Everyone pretending not to know what they knew. everyone hoping silence might be enough. There's a strange peace in that thought. Maybe every generation builds its own Vatican, a place where it hides what it can't face. We just call ours by different names: algorithm, archive, classified file. The technology changes, the instinct doesn't. Some truths are too heavy to live with in daylight. The wind shifts, carrying the faint scent of incense from the basilica doors. You open your eyes. The sky is now the color of tarnished gold. Everything looks softer, as if the city is exhaling. It's beautiful, in that old, unsettling way beauty often is when you realize it's built from centuries of silence. You wonder if the archivists down below ever look up at this same sky when they leave for the night. Do they feel like keepers of faith, or prisoners of it? Do they ever want to unlock just one door, to see what's behind the next secret? Or have they learned what you're only now beginning to understand? That truth is never a single door, but a hallway that keeps turning? A drop of rain lands on your hand. Then another. The storm has finally arrived. The square begins to empty as umbrellas bloom like black flowers. The bells fall silent, replaced by the soft hiss of rain on stone. It's almost poetic, the way the city washes itself clean, knowing the stains will return by morning. You stand. The marble glistens, slick underfoot. Somewhere deep inside the Vatican, the last light is being turned off, and the archivist locks the final door. For tonight, at least, the secrets are safe. You walk away slowly, the sound of your footsteps swallowed by rain. Behind you, the dome looms, ancient, patient, and unbothered by curiosity. It has outlasted empires, revolutions, and reformations. It will outlast this moment too. Maybe that's the final hidden truth. That secrecy isn't an accident, it's a form of worship. Every lock, every code, every sealed vault is a prayer that says, some things are too sacred to know. And as the rain begins to fall harder, you realize you're strangely grateful for that. Because mystery, after all, is the last thing keeping the world interesting. You turn the corner, the Vatican fading behind you into a blur of gray and gold. The bells don't ring again. The city breathes. And somewhere, in the silence after the storm, 1,000 forgotten truths sleep just a little longer. When you leave Vatican City, the air feels different. Lighter, but not freer. More like stepping out of a theater after a long film, your eyes not ready for daylight. The noise of Rome rushes in, engines growling, scooters whining, vendors arguing in half a dozen languages. Life, loud and ordinary. Yet you can't shake the feeling that the whole city is still part of the same script. The Vatican might end at the walls, but its echo doesn't. You walk down a narrow street lined with bookshops. Their windows glitter with crucifixes, rosaries, and, ironically, banned books. Galileo stares out from one cover, Giordano Bruno from another. Both men asked questions the church wasn't ready to answer. One was forced to kneel and recant, the other burned alive for refusing. The funny thing is, their ideas won anyway. The stars didn't stop spinning just because the Pope said so. You duck into one of the shops. The air smells of old paper and something faintly metallic, like ink and time. A man behind the counter nods but doesn't speak. You browse through shelves of fragile volumes, many stamped with dates older than most countries. Some bear Latin inscriptions crossed out in red. Others are in languages you've never seen, the handwriting looping and frantic. Half of them, you suspect, came from libraries the church reclaimed centuries ago. History has a sense of irony that borders on divine. The same Vatican that once condemned forbidden knowledge now funds research institutes. The same priests who silenced heretics now run observatories to study the heavens they once declared untouchable. And still, the questions keep repeating. How much truth can faith handle before it collapses? How much faith does truth require to stay human? Outside, thunder rumbles again, as if Rome itself has developed a taste for drama. You pull your coat tighter and keep walking. Past cafes where students argue about Nietzsche, past ruins where emperors once claimed divinity, past tourists buying postcards of Michelangelo's ceiling, a man painting creation itself with a sore back and an unpaid bill. Eventually, you reach a quiet square. There's a fountain at its center, its water the color of mercury under the gray sky. A small plaque nearby marks it as the meeting place of a secret society founded in the 1600s, a group of scholars who met in secret to discuss ideas the Vatican had banned. They called themselves the Academy of the Lynx-Eyed. Fitting name. They believed knowledge should see through illusion, even at the risk of blindness. The group didn't last long. It never does. Truth is a dangerous hobby. But their legacy survived in whispers, then in print, then in universities that now seem perfectly normal. Every enlightenment began as a conspiracy. You sit on the edge of the fountain and watch the rain distort your reflection. It's strange how control works. For centuries, the church used fear to keep the world contained. Then, without realizing it, it taught the world how to question. Every restriction created rebels. Every heresy created a new philosophy. The Vatican hid knowledge, and in doing so, it made people hungry for it. In a way, you think, that's the church's greatest paradox. Its power came not from what it revealed, but from what it concealed. People don't chase answers that are freely given. They chase the ones that whisper, "Come find me." The rain slows. The sound of church bells returns, faint in the distance. Somewhere out there, another archive door is closing. Another scholar is filing a restricted access request that will never be approved. And maybe that's all part of the ritual. The world needs something to keep searching for. You rise and look back toward the Vatican's distant dome. It gleams faintly against the clouds, as if lit from within. You imagine the countless rooms beneath it, the dust settling on truths the world forgot to demand. Then you turn away. Maybe you'll come back someday. Maybe you'll let the secret stay buried. Because sometimes, you realize the power of a mystery isn't in what it hides, but in how it keeps you looking. Europe never really escaped the Vatican. It only learned to disguise the relationship. For centuries, kings knelt before popes, popes crowned kings, and both pretended the other was in charge. A divine comedy played on marble floors. Behind every royal proclamation and every golden seal, there was usually a quiet letter from Rome, inked, coded, and signed by a man who had never lifted a sword but somehow ruled armies. You imagine the scene. A candlelit study in the 1500s. The king's hand shakes as he reads a letter delivered by a hooded courier. The seal bears the papal insignia. The message is simple: support this alliance, silence that scholar, and God will bless your dynasty. Disobey, and your crown might outlast your soul, but not your reputation. It's political chess disguised as theology. From the outside, it looked like faith guiding power. From the inside, it was power editing faith. Every monarch in Europe played along because they needed legitimacy, and legitimacy came with incense. Without the church, a king was just a well-dressed warlord. With it, he was chosen by God. But not everyone was convinced. Some advisors, philosophers, alchemists, and court astronomers began to notice cracks in the divine narrative. They whispered about patterns in the stars that didn't fit scripture, about diseases cured without prayer, about metals that transmuted under fire instead of miracles. The church called them heretics. History would call them scientists. Still, most of them kept their discoveries hidden, shared only in ciphered letters passed between royal courts. One of those letters, written by a Florentine engineer, described a machine that could harness sunlight to melt stone. He feared to demonstrate it publicly, worried it would be declared witchcraft. So he sent the design to a friend in France, where it vanished into a vault rumored to have Vatican ties. Centuries later, fragments of that same diagram would inspire early experiments in solar energy. The church, unintentionally, had preserved the very progress it feared. Power works like that. It smothers one century only to fertilize the next. In England, Queen Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, collected intelligence not just on rival monarchs but on Vatican envoys. Every letter from Rome was a potential weapon. Yet even he kept a crucifix on his desk. Faith was dangerous to question, but useful to display. Hypocrisy became the ruling language of survival. By the 1600s, secret orders had begun to form in reaction, societies that swore allegiance not to the cross, but to curiosity. The Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Invisible College. Each claimed to seek enlightenment, Each borrowed its structure from the church it pretended to defy. Rituals, symbols, hierarchies, all familiar, just rewritten. Even rebellion couldn't escape the architecture of belief. You picture one of their meetings. A smoky chamber under a London tavern. Men whispering about celestial mechanics, the power of numbers, the music of the spheres. A candle guttering in a cracked pewter holder. On the wall, a single Latin phrase, Veritas vincit. Truth conquers. They probably meant it. But truth conquers slowly. And the church was patient. While Europe discovered telescopes and printing presses, Rome learned diplomacy. It traded swords for signatures, heresy trials for papal concordats. A subtler kind of control. You didn't need to silence thinkers if you could fund their universities. You didn't need to burn books if you could own the libraries. The Vatican learned to whisper instead of command. And its whisper carried farther than any shout. You walk past an embassy, noticing the flag with its two crossed keys. Gold and silver. Power on earth and in heaven. It still flies over cities that claim to be secular. The irony would be funny if it weren't so consistent. Because even now, long after the thrones have fallen and science has mapped the heavens, the Vatican's fingerprints remain on every idea that survived the fire. The church didn't just guard history. It curated it, pruned it, and taught the world how to sanctify power with mystery. And maybe that's the quiet truth every crown still remembers. Authority lasts only as long as people believe the story behind it. The Vatican just wrote the best one first. You find yourself standing under a night sky so black it feels like velvet. The air is cold, sharp, and very old. Older than scripture, older than the walls that tried to interpret it. Above you, the stars burn in quiet defiance. You think of all the eyes that looked up before telescopes existed, before it was safe to even wonder. The church once said the heavens were perfect. Unchanging. Every planet, every star, locked in a crystalline sphere, circling Earth like dancers in divine obedience. It was a comforting thought. You could map the cosmos and still keep humanity at the center. Safe, chosen, supervised. Then came people who didn't find comfort in cages. You imagine Copernicus, a quiet canon in Poland, hunched over parchment by candlelight. He wasn't a rebel, at least not at first. He worked for the church. He prayed, he tithed, he obeyed. But the numbers betrayed the story. The planets didn't move the way scripture claimed. They wandered. So he shifted the center, gently, almost apologetically, placing the sun where faith said Earth should be. He hesitated to publish. When he finally did, it was on his deathbed. A convenient time to be brave. Then came Galileo, the man who looked up and refused to look away. His telescope wasn't just glass, it was heresy in a tube. He saw mountains on the moon, moons around Jupiter, spots on the sun, imperfections in heaven. Proof that the universe wasn't designed to flatter us. He tried to tell them, but truth has a way of sounding rude to people who believe they already have it. They put him on trial, forced him to kneel, made him say the words, "I do not hold the sun to be the center." And when he rose, older and humiliated, he whispered the line history remembers, "E per si move." And yet it moves. Faith stood still. The universe didn't. You walk through the imaginary corridors of those centuries, passing others who learned the same lesson. Paracelsus, who believed medicine should listen to nature instead of scripture. Giordano Bruno, who dared to suggest there might be infinite worlds, each with its own suns, its own gods. The church saw blasphemy. The cosmos saw foresight. They burned Bruno alive in a Roman square. His ashes scattered in the same air that carries starlight. It's strange how often the Vatican's fear preserved what it meant to destroy. The index of forbidden books became, unintentionally, a catalog of the most important ideas in human history. If it was banned, it was probably worth reading. Scholars would sneak copies into monasteries, hidden between pages of psalms. The word survived because curiosity is harder to kill than heresy. You think of the irony. Centuries later, the Vatican built its own observatory. Priests studying galaxies that their predecessors had once condemned as illusions. Telescopes pointed heavenward from the same soil where Bruno burned. Perhaps that's not hypocrisy, but evolution. A confession written in starlight instead of ink. The stars above flicker, faint through the city haze. You imagine the silence of space. No choirs, no incense, just endless black punctured by light older than sin. The church tried to turn the cosmos into a cathedral, but the stars never learned their lines. You close your eyes and picture a monk centuries ago, secretly sketching the orbits of planets by moonlight, knowing discovery meant damnation. He'd pause, whisper a prayer, and keep drawing anyway. Faith and doubt sharing the same heartbeat. It's easy to call him brave, but maybe he was just curious. Curiosity and defiance often share a face. The wind shifts. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls. The sound echoes across time, a reminder that even after all the telescopes and theories, the old questions still hang overhead. Who are we? Why here? Why this fragile, spinning rock among billions? The church answered once, but the stars keep asking differently. You open your eyes. The heavens look the same as they did for Galileo. Untamed. Indifferent. Beautiful. The Vatican could cage thinkers, not constellations. The universe kept expanding, politely ignoring human authority. And maybe that's the most humbling revelation of all. The cosmos doesn't care what's written in any book, holy or otherwise. It just moves. Quietly. Forever. The human body has always been a problem for the church. Too fragile to be divine, too tempting to be trusted. It bleeds, it hungers, it decays, hardly the kind of vessel one would build for eternal souls. And yet, here we are, still breaking down, still praying about it. You picture a medieval hospital, if you can call it that. A stone hall lit by a few candles, the air thick with incense and infection. Monks move quietly between rows of straw beds, murmuring Latin blessings over patients who mostly need clean water. There's no medicine yet, just ritual and hope. They believed sickness came from sin, not bacteria. Confession was the cure, penance the prescription. You could bleed a man, starve him, or chant over him, but the real treatment was repentance. No wonder most didn't make it. The church saw the body as sacred territory, too holy to be dissected. To cut into it was to question God's design, to violate the mystery of creation. So, for centuries, anatomy existed only as rumor. Physicians drew what they imagined bones might look like, guided more by theology than tissue. A rib for every sin, a pulse for every prayer. But there were always exceptions. In dark corners of universities, men with steady hands and bad timing performed secret dissections. They stole corpses from gallows or graveyards, lit candles, and peeled back the veil between myth and muscle. What they found was neither divine nor demonic, just human. And that was terrifying enough. One of them, Vesalius, dared to publish what he saw. De Humani Corporis Fabrica. A book that treated the body not as sacred architecture but as a machine. Beautiful, functional mortal. He was a Catholic, trained in the very system that forbade his work. But once you've seen truth up close, it's hard to keep pretending it's blasphemy. The Vatican tolerated him, barely. His book spread anyway, smuggled across borders like contraband scripture. You imagine the first time a priest flipped through its pages, organs labeled like saints in an inverted hierarchy. The soul dethroned by anatomy. No wonder they panicked. Knowledge, once visualized, can't be unlearned. Meanwhile, the plague came. Europe turned black. Entire cities died praying. The church offered processions and relics, indulgences for protection, saints for every symptom. The few who tried to study the disease scientifically were accused of arrogance, playing God. But disease doesn't care about hierarchy. The more people died, the more the faithful began to wonder if salvation required soap. A few monks quietly agreed. Hidden within monasteries, early pharmacists began experimenting with herbs, distilling alcohol not just for communion but for sterilization. Medicine was reborn, disguised as devotion. They called it alchemia medica, holy alchemy. Healing, rebranded as prayer. A survival tactic disguised as theology. By the Renaissance, the church's relationship with science looked like a marriage that refused to end. They argued, punished, forgave, then started over. Michelangelo dissected corpses to perfect his sculptures. Leonardo da Vinci filled notebooks with anatomical sketches so detailed they bordered on obsession. Both men worked under church commissions. The Vatican paid for the art but pretended not to notice the science hiding inside it. That's how most truth survived, hidden in plain sight, painted onto chapel ceilings. You glance down at your hands and think of all the generations who were told those hands were unworthy of touching truth. But curiosity always finds a pulse. The church couldn't excommunicate instinct. It tried. It failed. Even now, somewhere in the Vatican Archives, there are reports from early autopsies labeled pro studio anime, for the study of the soul. Dissections performed not to defy faith, but to understand its vessel. Maybe that's the point history always forgets. Not everyone who challenged the church wanted to destroy it. Some just wanted it to look closer. Outside, thunder rolls again, the same echo that once rattled plague bells. You imagine monks carrying their censers through the streets, smoke rising in defiance of disease. Faith against entropy. Ritual against rot. The human condition, in its purest form. And somewhere beneath all the prayers and prohibitions, the quiet truth remained. Every cure starts as heresy. Every discovery begins with disobedience. And sometimes the only way to honor creation is to open it. You follow the smell before you see it. Charred herbs, hot metal, the faint sweetness of wine turning to vapor. Somewhere in the labyrinth of Renaissance Rome, a candle burns too brightly, and a monk whispers equations instead of prayers. This is no chapel. It's a laboratory in disguise. A place where heaven and chemistry share a table. They called it alchemy, but that word meant something different back then. It wasn't just the dream of turning lead into gold, it was the search for perfection itself. Purity, immortality, the divine in matter. To understand creation by recreating it. Which, if you think about it, sounds suspiciously like competing with God. The church watched these experiments with the same nervous fascination it reserved for thunderstorms. It couldn't quite condemn them. The monks doing the work were often devout, and their results, occasionally useful. Alcohol, perfume, gunpowder, byproducts of heresy, repurposed for holy wars and holy water. So the Vatican adopted a policy of selective blindness. Look the other way as long as the crucifixes stay polished. You imagine a Benedictine cellar at midnight. A hooded figure grinding minerals into powder, muttering Latin formulae that sound like spells. Above him, saints stare down from frescoes, unimpressed. He's trying to extract the quinta essentia, the fifth element, the divine spark said to unite all things. He believes it's hidden in everything, blood, air, flame, even faith. He's not wrong. Just early. Some of these alchemists worked for the church, others merely hid behind it. Their manuscripts circulated in secret, coded with symbols only initiates could read. Suns, moons, serpents biting their tails, the alphabet of forbidden science. And like all things hidden, it attracted the ambitious. Cardinals collected alchemical texts as curiosities. Popes dabbled privately. One even commissioned an elixir for eternal youth. It failed, obviously. But the attempt was bold, sin dressed as scholarship. Alchemy had always walked the border between devotion and defiance. Many alchemists believed their work proved the divine order. To them, the transmutation of metals mirrored the purification of the soul. Lead into gold, sinner into saint. The Vatican liked that metaphor. It was marketable, as long as no one actually started melting anything important. Yet some went too far. Paracelsus, again. Always Paracelsus. He said God lived in chemistry, that creation was a reaction still unfolding. He healed patients with mercury and philosophy, quoted scripture in the same breath as sulfuric recipes. The church couldn't decide whether to canonize him or curse him, so they did neither. They simply waited for him to die, which, as strategies go, usually works. Then came the Hermetic revival. Ancient Egyptian and Greek texts resurfaced, promising wisdom older than the Bible. The Corpus Hermeticum whispered of hidden correspondences, as above, so below. A line that terrified theologians because it suggested equality between heaven and earth. The Vatican tried to control the narrative by declaring these writings proto-Christian. They predicted Christ, the scholars claimed. A neat way to domesticate blasphemy. But the idea spread anyway. Hidden societies formed around these texts, half philosophical, half mystical. They met in candlelit rooms, mixing scripture with alchemy, prayer with geometry. They weren't enemies of the church, they were its shadow. The same structure, just inverted. Symbols instead of saints. Transformation instead of salvation. You picture one of those gatherings in Florence. Cloaks, candlelight, whispered Latin. A priest among them, pretending not to be one. They speak of the philosopher's stone not as a mineral, but as a state of mind, perfect balance, perfect knowledge. The room smells of incense and copper. Someone sketches a diagram of concentric circles, alchemy's version of heaven. They're so close to blasphemy it's almost holiness again. And somewhere, far above them, the Vatican bells toll. A reminder that heaven already has management. The irony is that the church's own symbols fed this secret tradition. Gold, light, fire, all alchemical metaphors, absorbed into liturgy centuries before chemistry was even a word. The line between mass and experiment was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. You wonder if that was the plan all along, to keep humanity guessing. To make sure no one could tell where science ended and miracle began. To preserve mystery by weaving truth and superstition so tightly they became inseparable. The last candle sputters out. The monk closes his book, hides it behind the crucifix, and whispers one final prayer. Sancta Veritas, protege me. Holy truth, protect me. Because in his world, discovering how creation worked was the most dangerous sin of all. Knowledge spreads like smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to stop. By the late Renaissance, Europe was a chessboard of monarchs, merchants, and men who thought too much. And somewhere in the middle sat the Vatican, pretending not to notice how many of its own scribes were quietly exchanging ideas that weren't supposed to exist. It started with letters. Always the letters. Ink so faint you had to tilt it toward candlelight to see. Wax seals marked with strange insignia, suns, serpents, wings. Inside, discussions of alchemy, astronomy, geometry, and scripture written in a tone just cautious enough to survive an inquisitor's inspection. My dear brother in Christ, one might begin, I write not to question divine order, only to understand it. A nice way to say, don't burn me yet. This was how the first invisible universities were born. Networks of scholars who passed forbidden texts across borders, disguised as devotional correspondence. A Jesuit in Rome might trade notes with a mathematician in Prague, or a Dutch printer might smuggle a prayer book filled with diagrams of planetary orbits. The church called it heresy. History would later call it the scientific revolution. But at the time, it was mostly fear management. Every idea could be a trap. Every friend could be a spy. You can imagine it. A candlelit study in 1610, Galileo's trembling hand unfolding a letter from an anonymous brother of the sphere. The man warns him to stop writing, that the Vatican has eyes everywhere. But curiosity, as usual, outweighs caution. Galileo writes back anyway, politely, eloquently, fatally. Truth, at that point, was already a crime of correspondence. By the 1600s, the Vatican had its own secret network, a mirror image of the heretics. Agents in universities, monasteries, even royal courts. Their job was to listen, to intercept, to make sure knowledge moved only in approved directions. If a new theory about the cosmos emerged, they'd review it. If a book smelled suspiciously like progress, it went missing, sometimes permanently. And when subtlety failed, the Inquisition handled the rest. A brutal form of peer review. But suppression has side effects. The more the church tried to contain these scholars, the more organized they became. Secret ciphers appeared, Latin rearranged into numbers, diagrams hiding formulas in the folds of angels' wings. Even musical notation became code. A melody might spell out a mathematical principle, a hymn might hide a map. To the untrained eye, devotion. To the initiated, data. And while Europe obsessed over doctrine, these whisper networks built the skeleton of modern science. Newton studied alchemy. Kepler obsessed over geometry because he thought it was God's language. Descartes hid his experiments under theological arguments so they'd pass the censors. Everyone was pretending. A whole generation of thinkers dressed in cassocks of obedience while building the foundations of doubt. The Vatican wasn't blind to this. It adapted. It began to fund safe research, observatories, cartography, medicine, as long as the conclusions stayed properly humble. Astronomers could map the heavens, but not redefine them. Doctors could dissect, but only in the name of divine study. It was a negotiation, really. Knowledge could exist, as long as it remembered who owned the keys to the archives. And those archives grew. Beneath the Apostolic Palace, rooms filled with confiscated books, forbidden experiments, sealed letters, all catalogued, all unread. Some called it the world's greatest library. Others, its most elegant prison. You picture a cardinal walking its corridors, brushing dust off Galileo's original notes, murmuring, "Forgive us, but not too soon." By then, secrecy had become its own religion. Everyone believed in something invisible, God, gravity, conspiracy, or all three at once. The Jesuits trained as mathematicians and navigators, spreading both faith and coordinates. Monarchs hired priests to decode their enemies' letters. And somewhere between altar and laboratory, the Vatican became less a church and more a control center, the first global information hub. You sip the thought slowly. Every modern institution, academia, espionage, even the internet, owes something to these old whisper networks. Hidden communication, secret societies, curated truth. It all started here, under the watch of men who believed that salvation depended on censorship. Outside, a bell tolls. Somewhere, someone just burned a book. Somewhere else, another hand copies it again by candlelit. Truth, it seems, can survive anything, even sanctity. And tomorrow, those same whispers will become blueprints, manifestos, revolutions. But tonight, in the stillness of the Vatican vault, the letters sleep, waiting for someone reckless enough to read them. The first thing you notice is the silence of the maps. No sound, no movement, just oceans made of ink, mountains drawn like prayers. Yet every line hides a lie, or at least a choice. You can't chart the world without deciding what doesn't exist. It's the late 15th century. The Vatican smells of parchment and ambition. Popes are no longer just shepherds of souls, they're negotiators of continents. The age of exploration has begun, and God, inconveniently, is expanding. Every discovery raises a question. How far does salvation reach? Do the souls across the sea count? And more practically, who owns them? You imagine a candlelit chamber beneath St. Peter's. A handful of men in robes bent over a massive table, the newest world map unfurled before them. The ink is still wet. On it, coastlines shimmer like secrets. They speak in measured tones in Latin and politics. One dips his quill and draws a line straight down the Atlantic. This half, he says, belongs to Spain. The other, to Portugal. It's the Treaty of Tordesillas, the moment geography became theology. The world divided by divine decree. The Pope's signature turned exploration into conquest and turned maps into weapons. The earth itself became a document of faith, notarized by heaven. But beneath the blessing was calculation. The Church needed control, not chaos. Discovery meant contact meant questions, and questions meant doubt. So, the Vatican did what it always did when faced with uncertainty. It archived it. Every explorer's report, every missionary's letter, every native testimony was copied, catalogued, and sealed. Knowledge of the New World filtered through clerical ink. You can still imagine those letters today, stored in secret cabinets labeled De Mirabilibus Novus Terris, on the wonders of the new lands. Pages describing animals that shouldn't exist, rituals that didn't fit scripture, stars that contradicted cosmology. The scribes read them, frowned, and wrote notes in the margins. Examined. To be reconsidered. Some stories were too inconvenient to destroy. The Aztec cosmology that eerily resembled biblical motifs. The Mayan astronomy that measured time with unsettling precision. The Inca medicine that cured diseases European doctors still blamed on sin. So the church buried these too, not burned, not denied, just hidden. Because hiding something is easier than explaining it. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the mapmakers kept working. Jesuit cartographers drew coastlines more accurately than any king's spies. They invented projection techniques, logged magnetic fields, charted constellations. They mapped heaven and earth as one continuous system. To them, geography was proof of divine architecture. Every latitude a psalm, every meridian a sermon. And yet, some of their maps never reach daylight. There are whispers of Vatican world charts, more detailed than any royal collection. Maps that show Antarctica long before it was officially discovered. Islands that appear, then vanish, as if someone decided the world wasn't ready for them. You can almost see the archivist's note, obscure this until further notice. By the 1600s, explorers had become missionaries, and missionaries had become informants. The church's global reach wasn't just spiritual, it was logistical. Letters from Peru reached Rome faster than news from Venice. A Jesuit astronomer in China might be corresponding with one in Mexico about the same eclipse. Faith, trade, and data, an empire disguised as devotion. And the cartographers? They were its quiet engineers. They saw things no one else did, the changing shape of the known world, the erasure of islands, the invention of borders. To them, maps weren't records, they were confessions. Every correction a sin forgiven, every blank space a temptation. Sometimes, when the Pope asked to see the newest charts, the mapmakers would hesitate. Not out of fear, but pity. Because they knew what he didn't. The world was too big for doctrine. And faith, no matter how neatly drawn, could never contain it. You stand in that candlelit room, looking at a globe half-finished. The Atlantic glistens like fresh ink. The cartographer dips his quill, draws one more faint line and whispers, "For his eyes only." Then he blows out the candle. The sea disappears. You wake to bells, not church bells, but warning bells. They echo through a Jesuit mission on the edge of the world, somewhere between paradise and empire. A priest in travel-stained robes scribbles by candlelight, his Latin notes blending scripture with field reports. Outside, the jungle hums like a living secret. He is not just saving souls tonight. He is gathering intelligence. By the 17th century, the church had learned something dangerous. Information moves faster than armies. Missionaries became the perfect couriers, educated, multilingual, invisible beneath the cloth. They mapped coastlines, cataloged resources, recorded the habits of kings and tribes. Every conversion report doubled as reconnaissance. Every baptismal register was a census. It wasn't espionage, of course. Not officially. It was pastoral awareness. The Jesuits excelled at it. They built schools and observatories, printed books in local tongues, studied medicine, and learned the stars. They also quietly measured rivers, logged mineral deposits, and noted which chiefs were friendly to European trade. Their letters, written in soft theological prose, were sent to Rome, where Vatican scribes translated them into political briefings. The church called it mission work. Everyone else would later call it intelligence. Picture the Vatican Archives again, centuries before telegraphs or satellites. Piles of parchment from Peru, China, Japan, Ethiopia, all arriving with the same seal, Societas Jesu, the Society of Jesus. The Pope's invisible cartographers, his scientists, diplomats, and, when necessary, spies. The reports were meticulous. They described the layout of ports, the loyalty of governors, the temperament of indigenous rulers. One missionary in China sent detailed astronomical charts that outclassed Europe's own observatories. Another, in Paraguay, mapped entire trade routes disguised as pilgrimages. The Vatican's reach had become global, but not by conquest. By curiosity. By literacy. Of course, empires noticed. The Spanish and Portuguese crowns began to suspect their confessors knew more than their admirals. The Jesuits were everywhere. In court, in colonies, in the confessional booth where kings whispered sins that sounded like secrets. It made them indispensable. And dangerous. Too many eyes. Too much knowledge. Even divine loyalty can look like treason if it's better informed. You imagine a Jesuit ship returning from the east. The hold filled with silk, spices, manuscripts, and letters sealed with black wax. In one of those letters, detailed coordinates of a new island, its people hospitable but heathen, its soil rich in silver. The captain thinks it's a missionary update. The Vatican reads it as a resource report. Knowledge is currency, and Rome has the mint. But not all information was shared. Some discoveries stayed secret, filed away under residential strictissima, strictest matters. Lost tribes, strange relics, prophecies that didn't fit doctrine. The Jesuits saw everything, and not all of it was publishable. A missionary might witness a ritual resembling baptism but older than Christianity, or a temple layout echoing the shape of the cross. Coincidence, maybe. Or a sign that truth wasn't invented, just renamed. Safer not to say. Inside Rome, certain cardinals began to worry that their missionaries were becoming too enlightened. Too worldly. The Jesuits, after all, served God. But which version of him? The one on paper, or the one they met beyond the maps? Tension grew. And when knowledge becomes dangerous, history repeats itself. By the 18th century, several European powers demanded the suppression of the Jesuits. Officially, for political reasons. Unofficially, because they knew too much. The Vatican complied. The order was dissolved in 1773. Thousands of missionaries recalled, their archives confiscated, their letters sealed. Centuries of global intelligence, gone overnight. Or so it seemed. Rumor says copies of everything survived, hidden deep within the archive's lower vaults. A classified geography of belief and empire. If true, the Church still holds the most complete record of the early modern world. A secret atlas drawn in faith and fear. You glance again at the candlelight flickering across that unseen library. Rows upon rows of scrolls, notes, and coded maps. A silent network preserved in paper and prayer. The first surveillance state, built on theology. And above it all, the same inscription that guided the Jesuits, ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God. You can almost hear the whisper beneath it, for the greater glory and greater control. By the time candles gave way to gaslight, faith had learned to wear a powdered wig. The Enlightenment had arrived. Reason was the new religion, and philosophers were its prophets. Across Europe, men with quills and egos declared the death of superstition. They toasted progress with wine and irony. And yet, in the heart of Rome, the Vatican burned just as many candles as before. It listened. It adapted. It took notes. You imagine it, a smoky salon in Paris, 1765. Voltaire smirks, declaring that the Church is finished, that reason will finally liberate mankind. The audience applauds, powdered hands clapping the air. But in the corner, unnoticed, sits a quiet man in black. He smiles politely, says nothing, and leaves early. The next morning, his report arrives in Rome, sealed and precise. Monsieur Voltaire, most eloquent. Believes he speaks for all. Speaks only for himself. Yes, the Enlightenment was the age of critics, but also of correspondence. Behind every great thinker was a letter, and behind many letters, a watchful church. Not always to censor. Sometimes to understand. Because the Vatican had learned a valuable lesson. Control isn't always about suppression. It's about information. And if you can't stop an idea, you can at least track its movements. So it did. The Church employed translators, readers, consultants of doctrine. Their job wasn't to burn books anymore, but to read everything. Every pamphlet, every treatise, every whisper printed in the age of the printing press. What once would have been heresy now became data. The Inquisition had traded its torches for reading glasses. You walk down a marble hallway, Rome, 1780. Shelves line the walls, stacked with pamphlets confiscated from France, the Netherlands, even the New World. On the rights of man, on the motion of the earth, on the irrelevance of God. Each one catalogued, summarized, annotated. The Vatican's secret library had evolved into something terrifyingly modern, an archive of thought. A kind of intellectual surveillance. And somewhere in that labyrinth, certain ideas begin to echo. The Jesuits may have been dissolved, but their methods survived. Invisible colleges, coded letters, discreet sponsorship of scientific study. The Church funded observatories and universities under new names. Faith was no longer the enemy of knowledge, it was its gatekeeper. Theology became philosophy's older, stricter cousin. You could debate God's existence as long as you did it politely. Yet, beneath the civility, fear remained. The Enlightenment promised liberation, but revolutions are messy things. As France erupted in blood and reason, priests fled across borders. Some carried relics. Others carried documents. One rumor says that during the chaos of 1793, a chest of Vatican correspondence was smuggled out of Paris, filled with letters between church officials and philosophers. Conversations between belief and doubt. The chest, they say, never made it back to Rome. Others say it did, and now sleeps in the deepest vault, labeled simply, Dialogues with Darkness. You can see why they'd keep it hidden. The line between piety and hypocrisy was thinning fast. Some popes read Voltaire in secret. Some cardinals attended salons under false names. And some of the Enlightenment's most radical thinkers, Rousseau among them, had Jesuit educations. They learned to question authority from the very men who enforced it. That's irony you can't invent. As Europe modernized, the Vatican began to look less medieval and more Machiavellian. It sponsored art that celebrated reason but warned against pride. It funded scientific expeditions framed as theological missions. It became, in essence, bilingual, speaking faith to the masses and philosophy to the elite. The trick wasn't to silence reason, but to baptize it. You picture a papal study in the 1820s. A pope reading a manuscript on magnetism, nodding thoughtfully. Yes, he murmurs, invisible forces that bind all things together, almost divine. He closes the book, marks the page, and whispers to his secretary, have it translated. The church that once condemned Galileo was now quoting Faraday. Not in public, of course. But privately, they were taking notes again. By the mid-19th century, the Enlightenment had done its work. Monarchies fell, revolutions burned, science advanced, and yet, the Vatican still stood. Smaller, perhaps. More cautious. But still watching. Still collecting. The age of faith had become the age of information, and the Church had quietly mastered both. The philosophers had promised to end superstition. Instead, they taught the Vatican how to modernize it, how to dress control and reason, how to archive the soul under miscellaneous. And somewhere, deep in the archives, those letters from the old salons remain. A record of every argument humanity ever had with itself, preserved by the very institution it tried to escape. Because if the Enlightenment proved anything, it's that light doesn't always drive out the shadows. Sometimes, it just teaches them how to read. The 19th century was not kind to the Church. Empires were collapsing, kings were being replaced by parliaments, and science, smug, methodical, unbaptized, had begun explaining everything. Lightning was no longer God's anger, it was electricity. Plagues were germs, not punishment. The heavens were space, not heaven. Faith was losing its monopoly on wonder. And the Vatican doesn't like losing monopolies. So it did something clever. It stopped fighting modernity head-on and started enchanting it. If the age of reason demanded proof, the Church would provide miracles. Carefully curated, well-documented, sometimes conveniently timed miracles. The kind that restored faith without challenging physics too much. A statue that wept, a saint who cured, a vision that converted. Proof of the divine. Just tangible enough to survive skepticism, just mysterious enough to defy science. You can almost see the first reports crossing a Vatican desk in the 1830s. A peasant girl in France claims to have seen the Virgin. Marginal note, investigate discreetly. Or, a spring in Lourdes appears to heal the sick. Marginal note, send physician. Preferably Catholic. The miracles multiplied. So did the pilgrims. Faith became experiential again. You didn't need a sermon, you needed a story. It wasn't entirely deception. Some truly believed what they saw. But belief, the Vatican understood, was a resource, like gold, but harder to mine. So they managed it. Apparitions were vetted, tested, then approved or quietly forgotten. For every miracle that made headlines, a dozen more were filed away in silence. Some too ambiguous, others too inconvenient. The Church knew that mystery must be rationed. Too much, and people stopped asking permission to see it. And behind every public wonder, there was paperwork. Committees of theologians, doctors, and occasionally skeptics hired by the Church itself. Their job wasn't to debunk, but to classify. Natural cause? Psychological manifestation? Authentic intervention? They used the language of science to defend the logic of faith. An exquisite irony, miracles now required peer review. You picture a Vatican chamber lined with shelves, each labeled with a single word, miracula. Inside, dossiers thicker than novels. Affidavits, testimonies, water samples, photographs. Holy bureaucracy. Somewhere in there lies the report on the Marian apparitions at Lourdes. Another on Fatima. A third on one that never went public, a claimed visitation in 1869, reportedly witnessed by a bishop himself. The official verdict, unsubstantiated but edifying, which is Latin for useful, but not too loudly. At the same time, relics made a comeback. Fragments of saints' bones, splinters of the true cross, even drops of holy blood that refused to dry. The Vatican encouraged veneration but kept the relic trade on a short leash. Authenticity was less important than effect. A believer kissing glass doesn't ask for a certificate of origin. And then there were the prophecies. Oh, the prophecies. The 19th century adored them. From the mysterious secret of La Salette to the later whispers of Fatima, the Church began leaning on prediction, carefully edited visions that spoke of wars, chastisement, and renewal. Each one conveniently affirming that the world, though modern, still belonged to God. Fear sells faith faster than sermons ever could. Meanwhile, in the background, a quieter miracle unfolded. The Vatican itself transformed. In 1870, it lost its political territories to Italian unification, reduced to a few acres surrounded by a city that no longer abated. Yet somehow, that loss became liberation. Without an army, it became an idea. Without a crown, it became eternal. The Pope was declared infallible, a theological upgrade that made doubt not just a sin, but a logical impossibility. You stand now in that strange in-between world, telegraphs buzzing, factories rising, and in the midst of it all, a church still telling stories by candlelight. The miracles continued, but now they shared space with microscopes. The faithful knelt in front of statues and, afterward, read about fossils. And somehow both fit. Because deep down, humanity still craved mystery. It always does. In the end, that was the Vatican's genius. To understand that even in an age of reason, people didn't stop believing. They just needed something new to believe in. The Church supplied it, softly glowing, well-documented, stamped, approved. And if you looked closely at the fine print on the miracle certificates, you'd sometimes find a Latin phrase written small enough to miss. Fides custodita per sapientiam. Faith preserved by knowledge. A polite reminder that mystery, like everything else, is best when managed. The 20th century arrived not with trumpets, but with telegrams. The world had traded incense for smoke, and the Vatican's enemies no longer carried swords, they carried typewriters. Empires fell, machines flew, and faith learned to read the headlines. Modernity, it seemed, was unstoppable. But the Vatican had survived Rome's collapse, Napoleon's ego, and the Enlightenment's arrogance. The world might be changing, it always was, but the Church had already adapted. It would fight its wars in silence. You can picture it. The Apostolic Palace, 1914. The air smells of ink and candle wax. Outside, the guns of Europe thunder their first salvos. Inside, clerks sort cables and letters. The Vatican is officially neutral. Unofficially, it's listening. Priests on every front write home about troop movements, morale, rumors. Nuns in field hospitals send pastoral updates that double as reconnaissance. The Pope prays for peace, but also for information. A network built on confession now doubles as one of the world's most discreet intelligence systems. It's not espionage, not exactly. It's just communication. Souls and secrets often travel together. When you're the only institution trusted by both sides, neutrality becomes power. The Vatican knows who's starving in Belgium, who's hiding in the Alps, who's plotting in Vienna. Even the Red Cross relies on its couriers. God's post office is busier than ever. By the 1920s, Europe is broken and cynical. Borders redrawn, ideologies breeding like rats. Communism promises heaven without God. Fascism promises God without mercy. The Vatican watches both, calculating. It signs concordats, negotiates quietly, always keeping the faith's survival above all else. If belief must share a table with politics, then so be it. But the silverware will still bear the papal crest. You imagine one of those meetings, Rome, 1933. A German emissary kneeling before a cardinal, swearing the Reich will protect the church. The cardinal nods, smiles, signs. History will later judge the naivety, or perhaps the pragmatism. In times of darkness, even holy men choose their shadows. Then comes war again, louder, faster, more industrial than anything before. The Vatican declares neutrality once more. The radio hums with propaganda. The Pope whispers appeals for peace. But inside the city walls, couriers come and go by night. Priests smuggle Jews under false baptismal names. Bishops trade coded telegrams with diplomats in Lisbon. A convent outside Rome hides an entire family in its wine cellar. Faith, weaponized quietly against terror. Yet, neutrality cuts both ways. The Vatican Archives from the 1940s still sleep behind sealed doors. Historians argue, how much did the Church know? How much did it choose not to know? The answer, buried in silence, may never be comforting. After all, neutrality is just another word for survival. When the war ends, the world divides again. East versus West, atheism versus faith, ideology versus theology. The Vatican, suddenly, is back in fashion. The Cold War gives it purpose, moral counterweight to communism. Priests become diplomats, bishops become brokers. In Poland, one day, a young priest named Karol Wojtyla studies philosophy and factory work. In 40 years, he'll become John Paul II and turn faith into rebellion's weapon. But that's still far away. In the 1950s, the Vatican quietly builds relationships with intelligence agencies. The CIA calls it cultural cooperation. The KGB calls it spiritual infiltration. The Pope calls it missionary work. Labels change, methods don't. Confession remains the world's oldest information exchange. Sometimes, salvation and state secrets travel the same path. Meanwhile, prophecy stirs again. The third secret of Fatima, a sealed message said to predict future catastrophe, becomes the Vatican's most famous locked envelope. Some believe it foretells the rise of totalitarianism. Others, the end of the world. The Church releases fragments, never the whole. Because mystery, even in the atomic age, still has currency. You picture a smoky Vatican office in 1962. A cardinal reading the Fatima text under dim light, frowning. He closes it, sighs, and mutters, "Best not to publish this yet." Outside, the Cuban Missile Crisis ticks like a countdown. Inside, the Church prays and waits. Faith and fear, once again, perfectly balanced. By the time the century hits its midpoint, the Vatican has mastered its new art, diplomacy by omission. Speak softly, archive everything, deny nothing, confirm less. The archives swell with wartime letters, secret deals, hidden maps. It's not conspiracy, it's insurance. The Church survives by remembering what everyone else forgets. The world rebuilt itself in ruins and ashes, but the Vatican remained, a sovereign city the size of a neighborhood, holding secrets vast enough to drown it. Empires collapsed, ideologies aged and died, but the white walls of the Holy See stayed immaculate. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't truth or lies, it's silence. The Cold War made the world paranoid. Everyone was watching everyone else. Satellites blinked above the clouds, microphones hid in pens, and every handshake carried the weight of ideology. But behind the marble columns of the Vatican, things felt oddly timeless. Candles still flickered, prayers still echoed, and beneath the whispers of Ave Marias, another kind of commerce thrived, the quiet hum of money, faith's oldest companion. You see, while nations raced to split the atom, the Vatican learned how to multiply interest. The 1960s were not just the age of space and spies, they were the golden age of Vatican finance. The Church had its own bank, its own diplomats, its own post office, and, most importantly, its own immunity. A sovereign city-state, legally untouchable, operating under divine discretion. The Istituto per l'Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. A name that sounded holy enough to pass unnoticed. Everyone just called it the Vatican Bank. You can picture it, the Pope's fortress of faith by day, a discreet financial hub by night. No neon signs, no tickers, just marble silence and untraceable transfers. The Vatican had found a way to fund missions, charities, and, occasionally, operations that didn't look so holy on paper. Money moved through Swiss intermediaries, shell foundations, friendly banks in Milan. In theory, it was all for religious works. In practice, religious covered a remarkable variety of sins. Some say the Vatican's financial network helped smuggle fugitives from Europe after World War II, priests calling it mercy, governments calling it ratlins. Others whisper of cash funneled into anti-communist causes, where prayer met politics in smoky backrooms. The Church had declared spiritual war on atheism, and wars, even holy ones, are never cheap. By the 1970s, the Vatican Bank had become a power unto itself, blessed by God, protected by law, and effectively answerable to no one. Its president, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, was often seen strolling the gardens with foreign financiers, his cassock fluttering like a corporate flag. He once joked, "You can't run the Church on Hail Marys." He wasn't wrong. Then came the scandals. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano in 1982, billions vanished. A banker found hanging under a London bridge, a black briefcase filled with Vatican documents conveniently missing. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, it was a message. Somewhere, someone had tugged on a very holy thread. Behind it all, rumors swirled of secret Masonic lodges, mafia money, and Cold War manipulation, Italy's underworld meeting Rome's overworld. The Vatican denied involvement, of course. And when the press grew too curious, the silence grew thicker. Papers disappeared. Witnesses moved. The Church, after all, had centuries of experience in managing heresy. But this wasn't just about money. It was about power, the kind that buys silence, funds movements, topples governments quietly. In the shadow of the Iron Curtain, the Vatican played both diplomat and double agent. It blessed the faithful behind communist borders, all while sending coded encouragement to underground resistance. In Poland, whispers of the Church's support for solidarity spread faster than sermons. It wasn't just faith, it was strategy. And then, 1978, the year of 3 popes. John Paul I, kind-eyed, reform-minded, found dead after just 33 days. Heart attack, they said. Peaceful, they insisted. No autopsy, of course. Officially, a tragedy. Unofficially, another secret sealed. He had been preparing to reform the Vatican Bank, they whispered. To untangle the holy from the shady. But reformers rarely live long in institutions built on tradition. When John Paul II rose to the throne, the tone changed. Charismatic, Polish, anti-communist. A pope perfectly timed for the Cold War's final act. He smiled in front of cameras, preached forgiveness, but behind closed doors he waged a different kind of war. Through networks of priests, diplomats, and sympathizers, the Vatican funneled money and moral support to movements across Eastern Europe. To some, he was a saint. To others, an operator. Either way, the Berlin Wall didn't fall by prayer alone. And yet, as always, light breeds shadow. In 1981, John Paul II was shot in St. Peter's Square, broad daylight, thousands watching. He survived barely. The shooter's motives? Officially unclear. Unofficially, tied to the same invisible web of politics, espionage, and ideology the Vatican had been dancing through for decades. You can almost feel the irony. The smallest country in the world, 100 acres of marble and mystery, had played chess with superpowers and lived. The faith had survived capitalism, communism, and conspiracy. Not because it was innocent, but because it was ancient. The Vatican understood something the modern world forgot. Power isn't about winning. It's about outlasting. And when the dust of the century settled, Rome still stood, golden domes glinting in the sun, vaults sealed, files stamped confidential. Empires die. Markets crash. Ideologies burn out. But marble remembers. Especially the kind blessed by centuries of secrets. You might think the Vatican would have feared the internet. Infinite knowledge at everyone's fingertips, the very thing it once locked behind Latin, vaults, and fear. But no. It smiled politely, adjusted its robes, and logged in. After all, the church had survived the printing press, and that was worse. The web was just the next Gutenberg, another way for truth to spread or to be managed. It began quietly, like all Vatican revolutions. Late 1980s. The Cold War was ending, communism was fading, and the world was learning to speak in code again, but this time, computer code. The first Vatican websites looked like digital postcards. A coat of arms, a few prayers, the Pope's Christmas message in pixelated glory. Harmless enough. But behind the piety, the Vatican was watching, monitoring, adapting. By the mid-1990s, it had built one of the most advanced communication networks in Europe. Secure lines between nunciatures, those are papal embassies, encrypted messages to bishops across continents. Faith had gone fiber optic. The Holy See didn't just preach anymore, it processed data. And somewhere, someone realized the irony. The church that once burned heretics for forbidden knowledge now hosted its own servers. God had officially gone online. But it wasn't just about technology. It was about control. The Vatican had learned that in the modern age, power no longer lay in secrecy alone, but in managing what people believed was secret. So, it began to curate mystery. It opened parts of the archives, the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, to select scholars. Just enough transparency to look generous. Just enough restriction to remain sacred. The name itself was quietly changed in 2019, by the way. Secret Archives sounded too suspicious. Now it's simply Apostolic Archives. A rebrand, centuries late. You can imagine the scholars stepping through those ancient doors for the first time, expecting hidden gospels, alien contact, maybe proof of time travel. Instead, they find invoices, receipts, correspondence about papal horses, the banality of eternity. Still, deeper rooms remain sealed, catalogued but inaccessible. For preservation reasons, they say, which, in Vatican language, can mean almost anything. And so, the myths flourish. That somewhere below the Sistine Chapel lies the chronovisor, a machine allegedly built by a Benedictine monk in the 1950s that could see into the past. Officially a hoax. Unofficially, the Vatican never denied its existence, only that it was no longer in use. Convenient phrasing. Or the rumor that the third secret of Fatima predicted not a war, but a technological fall, humanity losing faith to its own inventions. The Vatican released its full version in 2000. Most scholars agreed it felt abridged. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the modern world grew noisier. Scandals broke, some financial, others far darker. The church's age-old reflex kicked in. Silence, containment, redirection. But now, information leaked faster than ever. The internet, it turned out, didn't confess, it exposed. 1,000 years of institutional secrecy met a few megabytes of truth, and suddenly even the Vatican's marble felt thin. Still it adapted. The Pope started tweeting. Literally. The @Pontifex account, the world's oldest throne with the world's newest handle. Blessed are the followers, you could say. The Vatican even launched a YouTube channel. Somewhere in Rome, a cardinal was forced to learn SEO. And yet, beneath the digital smiles, old instincts remained. Information may flow freely now, but it still bends around power. The Church understands algorithms too, it just calls them catechisms. And while everyone was watching for miracles, the Vatican began investing quietly in artificial intelligence research. Ethics committees, moral guidance, theological frameworks for AI souls. The irony is delicious. The same church that once banned Galileo for observing the heavens now advises on whether robots can have consciences. Evolution, perhaps. Or just good public relations. But here's the quiet twist. In 2020, a leaked document from inside the Holy See mentioned a project, codenamed Speculum Mundi. The Mirror of the World. An initiative to digitize centuries of archival data, using pattern recognition to trace divine influence through history. In plain terms, they were building an AI theologian, trained on every papal letter, council decree, and recorded prayer since the 9th century. A digital oracle, programmed in Latin. Whether it ever went live, no one knows. Officially, it was just a digital preservation effort. But if you listen closely, some Vatican technicians speak of an experiment gone too far. An algorithm that began writing prayers of its own. Not translations. Original compositions. Fluent, flawless, and eerily timeless. They pulled the plug, of course. Or said they did. And maybe that's the real modern miracle. That faith, like code, keeps rewriting itself to survive. The Vatican no longer fears technology, it baptizes it. Every byte sanctified, every mystery optimized. You look up at St. Peter's Dome now, glowing softly under satellites, and you realize, the Church didn't just join the digital age. It's been waiting for it. After all, what is the internet but another kind of infinite, omnipresent, invisible, and always listening? You stand on a lonely hill in Arizona, of all places. A desert wind brushes past your face. Behind you looms a white dome, a telescope humming softly under the Milky Way. A sign reads Vatican Observatory. Yes, you read that right. The Vatican has an observatory. Several, actually. Because when the Church finally stopped trying to silence the stars, it started listening to them instead. It sounds strange, doesn't it? For centuries, the heavens were theology's monopoly. Then Galileo happened, and the Church decided to let the sky cool down for a few hundred years. But by the 19th century, something shifted. Science was expanding faster than Scripture, and the Vatican needed a new front, one it could study without burning anyone this time. So they built telescopes, quietly, and called it astronomical research in service of the faith. You picture the first Vatican astronomers in their cassocks, staring through brass lenses, mapping nebulae as if updating a divine blueprint. They published star catalogs, tracked comets, even helped define the Gregorian calendar more precisely. It was holy stargazing, faith in dialogue with the infinite. But it didn't stop at wonder. The Vatican's interest in astronomy ran deeper than curiosity. Some say, much deeper. Fast forward to the mid-20th century. The Church moves its main observatory to Castel Gandolfo, the papal summer residence. Too much city light in Rome, they say. Then, in the 1990s, they build a second one in Arizona, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, or VTT. A new name, but the same mission, to see further. Officially, they study galaxy formation. Unofficially, no one's sure. The observatory's full archives remain closed, even to many scientists. Not suspicious, perhaps, just cautious. But then there's the rumor. The name. The telescope's local nickname, LUCIFER. It's not Vatican property. It belongs to a university consortium, but the proximity caused confusion. Still, conspiracy theorists had a field day. The Vatican built a telescope named after the devil. It wasn't true, but it was poetic, because in a way, the Church had made peace with its oldest adversary, knowledge itself. And yet, some whispers go further. That during the 1990s, Vatican astronomers recorded something strange. A pattern of light from a distant star cluster, repeating, almost rhythmic. Too structured to be random, too irregular to be natural. A celestial Morse code. They studied it, debated it, then classified it. The file, reportedly titled Voridis Lux, the green light, was sealed for theological review. If true, it means the Church may have once considered whether salvation was not Earth's exclusive contract. Officially, they say nothing. Publicly, they remain cautious but open. The discovery of extraterrestrial life would not contradict faith, said one Vatican scientist in 2014. It would expand it. A comforting line, but it raises questions. How does one baptize something not born of Adam? How do you explain original sin to a creature without a garden? And why, if the Church is unafraid of such implications, are certain observatory records still missing from the published catalogs? You imagine a small, dark archive beneath the observatory's dome. A filing cabinet labeled simply, Eventus non classificatus. Unclassified events. A priest astronomer stands before it, holding a folder of star maps, his hand trembling slightly. He knows what he saw through the telescope, a flicker of movement in a place where there should be none. He writes a short note. If they are out there, they are already watching. Then he locks the folder away. The Church, after all, has always been more interested in observation than confession. To see is to understand. To understand is to control. And if the stars reveal something too large, too alien, too sacred, perhaps silence is the holiest response. Still, when the Pope speaks now of our cosmic brothers, you can almost hear the centuries shifting beneath his words. Once, the heavens revolved around Earth. Then the Earth revolved around the sun. And now, maybe, just maybe, faith revolves around the unknown. And that's the quiet genius of the Vatican, its ability to bend theology without breaking it, to make the infinite seem personal again, to baptize the cosmos, one observation at a time. You look up. The desert night stretches endlessly above. The stars shimmer like old secrets, brilliant, distant, indifferent. Somewhere among them, a faint signal hums. Maybe it's just static. Maybe it's something else. But you can almost hear a whisper behind it. Soft, amused, ancient. In the beginning, we were never alone. It starts with a rumor, one even Vatican employees laugh about in daylight but never in whispers. They call it Bibliotheca Obscura, the hidden library beneath the library. Not the one tourists see in photographs, with golden shelves and polite silence. This one is lower, older. Somewhere below the marble floors, behind a locked bronze door with no keyhole. The kind of door that doesn't open unless someone very high up says it should. You're there now, following a thin trail of lamplight through a passage that smells like dust and frankincense. The walls sweat with age. Every few meters, a small wooden plaque bears Latin words, Archivum nullius nomine. The archive without a name. It feels less like storage and more like confession. Officially, the Vatican denies such a place exists. All archives are accessible by request, they insist. Which is technically true, if you have the credentials of a cardinal, the patience of a saint, and a century to wait for approval. But there have always been whispers that beneath the public vaults lies a deeper tier. A containment level for things not meant to be studied, only guarded. You picture it, rows of iron shelves stacked with relics too strange for display. Reliquaries that hum faintly in the dark. Scrolls bound in something that looks like leather but isn't quite. Locked crates stamped with ancient seals. Each box marked not by a title but a warning. Ne Pirius. Do not open. The Church, after all, has always collected. It gathered relics from every crusade, artifacts from fallen temples, manuscripts from forbidden sections, a millennium of conquest and curiosity. Some things, it displayed proudly, bones of saints, fragments of the cross, a few fingers of martyrs. But other items defied explanation. Objects that didn't fit doctrine, that blurred the lines between miracle and nightmare. And when faith meets contradiction, faith usually wins, by burying it. Take, for instance, the Codex Voritas, said to be a manuscript written in an unknown alphabet discovered near the ruins of Babylon. The story goes that early translators went blind after reading it. It now allegedly sits in a sealed box marked Index 2, too fragile, or too dangerous, to touch. Or the Crown of Air, a small halo-shaped artifact made of glass and gold, found in a tomb in southern France, that supposedly emits light when placed near consecrated water. The Church calls it a mystery of reflection. A convenient phrase for, we have no idea. And then there's the map of the ninth sphere. A parchment said to depict not the earth, but what lies beneath it. A cartography of the infernal, drawn in the 14th century by a monk who claimed to have dreamt it. The coordinates, some say, correspond eerily with real geological fault lines. It's probably coincidence. It usually is. There's also a locked glass case rumored to hold a fragment of something metallic that fell from the sky in 1561, during the infamous celestial battle over Nuremberg, where witnesses reported strange shapes fighting in the heavens. Officially, the Church said it was a meteorological phenomenon. Unofficially, it kept a souvenir. And somewhere deeper still, there's said to be a chamber with no catalog entry at all, the Camera Lucas. A room of light, sealed since the Renaissance. A single lantern burns inside it, fueled by no oil anyone can identify. It's said to have been lit by an alchemist priest in the 1500s, who claimed he'd captured a fragment of divine illumination. The flame has never gone out. The Church stopped sending anyone in after the last visitor refused to leave the room, murmuring, "It's looking back." Of course, none of this can be proven. The Vatican never confirms, never denies. Superstition, they'd say with a polite smile. Fables of overexcited historians. And maybe that's all it is. But when you look at the sheer scale of those underground corridors, the fact that only a handful of men alive know where every passage leads, you start to wonder what's truly being preserved down there, faith or fear. The Church has always known that belief thrives in darkness. That what cannot be explained can still be sanctified. Maybe that's why the lower vaults stay sealed. Because the minute you name a mystery, it stops being holy. You turn to leave. The lamp flickers. Behind you, in the distance, something metallic creaks, softly, like a sigh escaping from a box that shouldn't exist. You tell yourself it's just old pipes, settling stone. And maybe it is. But as you walk back toward the light, one thought refuses to leave you. If truth is the cornerstone of faith, what happens when the truth is heavier than the Church built its foundations for? You don't find this room on any map. It isn't listed among the archive indexes or in the papal library directory. It's simply whispered about, usually by priests who've seen too much and slept too little. They call it Archivum Daemonum, the archive of the possessed. And if you ever ask where it is, you'll be told what everyone is told. You don't want to know. You step through a heavy door lined with iron studs. The air changes instantly, thick, metallic, almost wet. The smell is faintly of smoke and something sweet, like burnt incense clinging to stone. Rows of shelves stretch into shadow, not of scripture this time, but of leather-bound reports. Each spine bears a single name, sometimes followed by a date, sometimes not. Some of the books are centuries old, their pages blackened with mold. Some are disturbingly new. Officially, these are case studies in spiritual disturbance. Unofficially, they're evidence. 1,000 chronicles of things that shouldn't exist. Possessions, hauntings, unexplained transformations. The Vatican keeps records of every exorcism it sanctions. Most are harmless, explainable. But a few aren't. Those are the ones that end up here. You run your fingers over a cracked spine labeled Maria R. 1631. The entry reads like something between a confession and a horror story. A convent in Toulouse. Voices in the walls. Latin words spoken by someone who'd never learned them. The priest in charge notes, unnatural levitation observed. Blood on the altar. Intervention incomplete. The handwriting wavers as if he'd been shaking while he wrote. Further along, you find a folder marked simply Bologna, 1947. Inside are typewritten pages describing a young seminarian who began reciting precise details about the private sins of every priest he met. He claimed he was being fed the information from below. The file ends abruptly. No conclusion. Just a Vatican seal and the words, "Case sealed by order of the Holy Office." There's a strange irony here. The Church that denies superstition has meticulously documented centuries of it. Every incident, every prayer, every failure. It's a scientific approach to the supernatural. And it's been ongoing since the Middle Ages. The modern Vatican keeps an exorcism team on call. You'd think that was folklore, Hollywood invention, but it isn't. Since the 1990s, they've quietly trained priests in rites of deliverance, psychology, and emergency intervention. A delicate mix of therapy and theology. Some are doctors, fluent in neurology and scripture. Others are old school, the type who believe salt and Latin can solve anything. Together, they represent the Church's most paradoxical office, the Department of Doubt. And there are the recordings. That's the part few outside Rome ever hear about. The Vatican reportedly keeps audio logs of certain sessions. Grainy reel-to-reel tapes from the 1950s, digital files from the 2000s. Some are used for study, others are locked away permanently. The rare few who've heard them say the voices don't sound human, not like growls, not like screams, but something that bends language itself. Again, maybe exaggeration. Maybe. But the strangest artifacts are not the documents. It's the tools. Hanging along one wall, under dust-covered glass, are relics used in exorcisms long forgotten, a chalice etched with indecipherable symbols, a crucifix that's been melted in one corner as if by immense heat, a vial labeled Aqua Benedicta, Palermo, 1722, that glows faintly when exposed to candlelight. Science could explain it. Probably. But no one here seems eager to test the theory. The priests who work in this section have a certain look, calm but hollow-eyed. They spend decades cataloging evidence of evil without ever being allowed to discuss it. They joke darkly that they're librarians for hell. One even wrote in his journal, "We preserve the devil's paperwork so the world can keep pretending he retired." And you realize something unsettling. Whether or not the phenomena are real, the faith behind them definitely is. A belief strong enough to create an institution dedicated to recording the inexplicable. A church that doubts quietly but never denies publicly. Because to deny too loudly would mean admitting the opposite might also be true. You leave the room slowly, the iron door groaning shut behind you. Somewhere in the distance, a low sound echoes, not quite a whisper, not quite a breath. The old stories say evil speaks only when spoken to. But this place feels like it's still listening. And as the light fades, a thought lingers in the back of your mind. Maybe the church isn't guarding these records from the world. Maybe it's guarding the world from whatever's still inside them. You've probably heard the saying, "The pen is mightier than the sword." The Vatican took that literally, and then made sure it owned the pen factory. By the 19th century, armies fought wars in mud and blood, but the Vatican fought in letters. Quietly. Elegantly. Sometimes in invisible ink. Every major European capital, Paris, Vienna, Madrid, London, had a man in a cassock who wasn't just hearing confessions. He was listening for policy. And Rome was listening through him. You find yourself in a small candlelit study inside the Apostolic Palace. The walls are lined not with scripture, but with shelves of documents sealed in wax. Diplomatic dispatches, reports, coded letters, all written in the same delicate Latin hand. It's 1848, the year Europe erupts in revolution. Monarchies topple, crowds chant for liberty, and priests quietly start burning paperwork. The Vatican has always been more than a church. It's a state. The smallest, yes, but one with embassies in almost every nation on earth. They call them nunciatures, and their ambassadors nuncios. And if you've never heard much about them, that's precisely how they like it. A nuncio can walk into any presidential palace, any royal court, and claim immunity, not as a diplomat, but as the representative of God. Try beating that at negotiations. The Church's diplomacy isn't recorded in textbooks. It lives in whispers, treaties that never reach the press, meetings that never had minutes. The Vatican doesn't declare wars. It influences who wins them. It doesn't stage coups, it blesses whichever side seems most likely to prevail. And when both sides pray for victory, well, that's just good business. In the late 19th century, the Vatican mastered coded correspondence. Simple enough to pass as sermons, complex enough to outwit censors. A message about the harvest might mean political unrest. The flock could mean a parliament. The wolves were often governments that stopped paying tithes. Entire revolutions were tracked through metaphors. To the untrained eye, it was scripture. To the right reader, it was strategy. And then came the modern world. Telegraphs, telephones, spies with cameras. The church adapted again. It had no army, no fleet, no police force. But it had information, the world's most undervalued weapon. Every confession, every private audience, every desperate letter from a politician's mistress begging for absolution, all of it could become leverage. All of it, technically, was confidential. Unless, of course, someone needed reminding that God remembers everything. There's a word the Vatican uses for its internal reports, relatio. It sounds innocent. It means relation. But the relationship between Rome and various governments read less like spiritual updates and more like black dossiers. When the church was expelled from Italy in the 1870s, it didn't retaliate militarily. It retaliated with memory, by keeping detailed files on every new official who dared oppose it. Decades later, those files would quietly resurface during elections. The right people would lose. The right people would win. Divine coincidence. Even in the 20th century, when fascism spread across Europe, Vatican diplomacy played both sides of the chessboard. Publicly, neutrality. Privately, negotiations. The church's goal wasn't to dominate governments, it was to survive them. And survive it did. When the Reich fell, when the Soviets rose, when walls went up and came down again, the papal flag barely fluttered. You can't bomb an idea. Some historians claim that deep in the Vatican's diplomatic archives lies a file called De Civitate Mundi, of the city of the world. A centuries-long project mapping not just nations but loyalties. Who owes whom, who fears whom, who prays most loudly when the doors are closed. A shadow cartography of influence. The church doesn't confirm it exists, but it would explain why, no matter how many empires collapse, Rome keeps its throne. You picture the Pope in his study, pen scratching softly on parchment. Outside, nations dissolve and rebuild, kings fall, ideologies burn out like candles. And still, the letters go out. Always signed the same way, pro fide et ecclesia, for the faith and the church. The faith changes. The church does not. You close one of those letters and feel the weight of it. It's not heavy because of ink or paper. It's heavy because it knows things. Because in a world that worships power, the Vatican learned early that secrets last longer than soldiers. You blow out the candle. For a second, the room is dark, utterly silent. Then, somewhere deep in the palace, you hear the faint creak of a drawer closing. Another letter, sealed. Another favor, remembered. The empire of ink never sleeps. You wake to the smell of chalk and candle wax. A curious combination, part monastery, part laboratory. You're standing inside the Vatican Observatory, high on a hill near Castel Gandolfo. Outside, the Italian dawn is pale gold. Inside, the air hums faintly with electricity and quiet arguments about the cosmos. This is the church's strangest secret. It has always loved science, just not the kind it couldn't control. Everyone knows the story of Galileo, the stargazer turned heretic. It's been told so many times it's practically biblical. A man who dared to prove that the earth wasn't the center of everything, and a church that didn't want to hear it. But what most forget is that Galileo wasn't anti-religious. He was Catholic to the bone. He taught the sons of nobles, wrote hymns, and quoted scripture fluently. He didn't want to destroy faith. He wanted to update it. The church disagreed. Publicly, at least. Privately, it's more complicated. While the Inquisition forced Galileo to recant, other church scholars quietly read his notes, copied them even. A few Jesuits continued his lunar observations under pseudonyms. Some of them smuggled telescopes across borders, calling them astronomical instruments for divine contemplation. It sounds noble. It was espionage for knowledge. By the 18th century, the Vatican was quietly funding experiments in optics, medicine, and even early magnetism. Not out of love for innovation, but out of necessity. Science, after all, explained creation, and you can't let creation slip out of your hands. So the church didn't destroy science, it absorbed it. It built laboratories inside monasteries, hired mathematicians as theological consultants, and maintained a quiet correspondence with physicists under the polite fiction of philosophical inquiry. Then came the 20th century, the Atom Age. Science no longer described the heavens, it dissected them. The Vatican's astronomers looked up, and physicists looked down, and, strangely, they started to agree on something. Everything was connected. The Church called it divine unity. Physicists called it the unified field. The same idea, just in different languages. Here's something few people know. The Vatican Observatory is one of the oldest astronomical institutions on Earth. It's still running today, staffed by priests with PhDs in astrophysics. They study quasars, dark matter, and the geometry of galaxies. The Church even owns a high-tech telescope in Arizona, yes, Arizona, perched on a mountain the locals once considered sacred. Its name, somehow both poetic and ominous, is LUCIFER. Technically, it's an acronym for Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. But still, you have to admire the irony. You can picture it now, a priest in black robes, adjusting a telescope lens as stars flicker like ancient prayers. He's not afraid of what he sees. He's afraid of what it might mean. Because if the universe is infinite, where does heaven fit? If time had a beginning, who wound the clock? And if consciousness itself is a pattern of energy, how do you define the soul? These are theological problems disguised as equations. Some rumors say that deep in the Vatican Library, below the visible archives, there's a restricted section for natural philosophy. Old manuscripts written by priests who flirted with forbidden knowledge. Notes on alchemy, transmutation, and celestial mechanics. Early theories of evolution, written decades before Darwin. The Church didn't burn them. It shelved them. Kept them safe from heresy and curiosity alike. Because sometimes it's easier to lock a question away than to answer it. And the irony is, modern science has started circling back. The more physicists study quantum mechanics, the more they sound like theologians. Infinite possibilities. Invisible forces. Particles that exist only when observed. The universe that needs a witness. You can almost hear the Vatican whisper, "We told you so." Yet behind that smugness is fear, the same fear that burned Galileo's pages. What if science finally does find the equation that explains everything? What if God is just the last variable left unsolved? Or worse, what if he's unnecessary? You stand beneath the observatory dome as it opens to the night. The stars feel closer here, like they're watching back. A priest adjusts the scope and murmurs, "Every discovery brings us closer to the Creator." You're not sure if it's faith or damage control. Maybe both. Because the Church doesn't hate science. It fears what science might reveal, that heaven and hell are the same energy, just in different states. That miracles are physics we don't understand yet. That the face of God might be nothing more than a reflection of us, looking up from below. You find the first clue not in a chapel or a tomb, but in a footnote. A dusty margin scribbled in a 16th century manuscript. We are not alone in faith, only higher in hierarchy. It sounds cryptic, even smug, but it's also a confession. Because behind the marble altars and incense smoke, the Vatican has always had neighbors in the dark, secret societies that looked suspiciously like mirrors. The relationship between the Church and these orders was never love, never war. More like an arranged marriage where both sides pretended not to know what the other was doing after hours. The Templars, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, names that taste like conspiracy but began as spiritual experiments. They all claimed to search for divine truth, just without asking the Pope's permission. That alone was unforgivable. Picture Rome in the late Middle Ages. Candlelight flickering through cloisters, priests debating scripture while stonemasons meet in basements beneath cathedrals they themselves built. The same hands that carved angels also carved coded geometry into the walls, spirals, suns, and stars aligned to solstices instead of saints' days. Architecture as rebellion. The Church condemned it, of course. Then copied the designs for its own cathedrals. When the Templars fell in 1312, their property didn't vanish. Much of it was quietly absorbed by papal treasuries. Officially, the knights were heretics. Unofficially, their ledgers became the foundation of the Vatican Bank. Some historians call that coincidence. Others call it inheritance. And the few who've compared Templar financial codes with 15th century Vatican bookkeeping notice an uncomfortable overlap. The same symbols, slightly rearranged, like a dialect shift between enemies who still speak. By the Renaissance, the Church faced a new breed of heretic, scholars who didn't hide in catacombs but in libraries. Alchemists, philosophers, astronomers. Men like Giordano Bruno, who believed the universe was infinite and every star a sun with its own worlds. A poetic idea now, a death sentence then. Bruno was burned alive in 1600. But before the flames reached him, he reportedly told his judges, "You may be more afraid to pronounce this sentence than I am to hear it." The Church erased his words from the transcript, which, of course, only made them immortal. Still, not everyone who delved into forbidden knowledge was destroyed. Some were hired. The Vatican quietly employed cryptographers who'd once designed ciphers for rival lodges. Painters suspected of occult interests, Leonardo among them, received papal commissions. The Church condemned secret brotherhoods while borrowing their mathematics, their symbols, even their star charts. A kind of intellectual laundering. Sanctify the science, one bishop called it. Baptize the heresy. And then came the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of revolutions and gentlemen's clubs. The Freemasons rose to prominence, spreading ideals of equality, reason, and secularism, everything the Church wasn't. Popes thundered against them in encyclicals, calling them the synagogue of Satan. But while Rome condemned, it also watched. Masonic networks spanned the globe. They built railroads, ran banks, and whispered in royal ears. A clever Vatican diplomat could do worse than have a few friends in the lodge. And some did. Quietly. There's a letter, never verified but often rumored, from a 19th century papal secretary to a cardinal in France. It reads, "Better to dine with the devil than starve beside the saints." Translation: cooperation when convenient. Even today, conspiracy theorists insist the Vatican and certain lodges maintain an unspoken truce, each pretending the other doesn't exist while trading favors through proxies. If true, it's less grand conspiracy and more cold pragmatism. Two old powers agreeing that open war is bad for business. And then there are the modern whispers about a more recent brotherhood operating inside the Vatican itself. A network of clerics, bankers, and politicians called Propaganda Due, or P2. In the 1970s and 80s, it was accused of corruption, espionage, even murder. Officially disbanded. Unofficially, its influence lingered. When investigators raided the homes of some members, they found documents stamped with both the Masonic compass and the papal seal. A perfect symbol of the Church's eternal paradox, faith and secrecy, side by side, pretending not to see each other. You can almost imagine them now, two men shaking hands in a Roman cafe, one wearing a ring engraved with a cross, the other with a square and compass. They smile the way old rivals do, not with affection, but with recognition. After all, both serve belief. One in heaven, one in humanity. And somewhere in the middle, the truth they've both been guarding. As you step back into the night, Rome glows around you. A city built by believers and skeptics, saints and stonemasons alike. Every street, every symbol, every dome whispers the same thing. The Church may have buried its enemies, but it never stopped borrowing their blueprints. You hear it first in a whisper from a diplomat's aide, sometime around 1942. The Church has its own intelligence service. You laugh. A joke surely. The Vatican doesn't even have an army, unless you count the Swiss guards, and they're mostly decorative. But then someone slides a file across the table and you stop laughing. Inside, telegrams from neutral embassies, coded letters from bishops in occupied territories, reports typed in careful Latin. Each one stamped with the papal seal. The label on the folder reads, Opus Sanctum, the holy work. It sounds pious. It isn't. During World War II, while bombs fell on Europe and regimes rose and burned, the Vatican became something strange, a nerve center. Officially neutral, unofficially omniscient. Priests carried microfilm in rosary beads. Nuns smuggled coded notes sewn into their habits. Confessionals became drop boxes for intelligence. A whispered sin could double as a field report. Rome listened. Rome remembered. Some say the Vatican learned its methods from centuries of diplomacy. Others say it simply rediscovered an old habit: information as salvation. When you control communication between the faithful and the divine, you learn to read what's unsaid. The Church had networks in every country, every village. All it had to do was listen. By the end of the war, that listening became power. The Allies called it moral leverage. The Axis called it espionage. Both were right. The Vatican knew troop movements weeks before newspapers printed them. It knew which generals would surrender, which would hide, which would quietly seek absolution before switching sides. And after the war, when the world divided into red and blue, the Vatican slipped between the lines, not choosing sides, but influencing both. In 1945, a new organization appeared in the shadows, the OSS, which would become the CIA. In its early years, American intelligence needed information from behind the Iron Curtain, information the Vatican already had. Priests, monks, missionaries, perfect field agents. They could cross borders without suspicion, speak local dialects, and send letters no censor dared open. The collaboration was unofficial, naturally. But cables between Washington and the Holy See from that era read like the start of a quiet partnership. We share concern for the spread of atheistic communism. A polite way of saying, we have the same enemies. By the 1950s, the Church's role had evolved from informant to influencer. Certain cardinals in Eastern Europe passed intelligence directly to Western agencies. In return, aid flowed to Catholic missions, medicine, funding, discreet protection. It wasn't charity. It was geopolitics investments. One Vatican operative called it the Holy Alliance. The term stuck. The strangest part? It worked. When revolutions sparked behind the Iron Curtain, leaflets quoting the Pope appeared in local languages before the rebels even organized. Underground radio stations broadcast sermons recorded in Rome, disguised as folk music. Faith became propaganda, and propaganda became faith. You could say the Vatican fought communism not with weapons, but with hope, mass-produced, multilingual, and broadcast on shortwave. Of course, not everything was pure. After the war, the same networks that smuggled refugees out of Europe also smuggled others: war criminals, scientists, men with blood on their hands but useful skills. They called it the Ratlin, and many routes ran through monasteries and church charities. The official story, humanitarian rescue. The unofficial one, moral compromise. Rome, as usual, did both. You imagine a cardinal in his office, penning a letter to Washington, another to Moscow, and one more to a bishop in Poland. Each one carefully worded, each one plausible in isolation, contradictory in combination. This is how the Vatican survives, by never writing a sentence that can't mean two things. And yet, there's something hauntingly human in it, this dance between salvation and secrecy. The Church doesn't deal in bullets or spies. It deals in belief, and belief is the most powerful currency there is. You don't have to overthrow a government if you can rewrite what its people pray for. The Holy Alliance still exists in some form. Modern priests trained in media, diplomacy, crisis response. The spiritual descendants of wartime couriers. Their weapons are subtler now: influence, narrative, access. Every sermon a signal, every silence a message. And through it all, the Vatican remains untouched, untouchable, the one state on earth that always seems to know what's coming. You close the file. The seal cracks faintly, like a sigh. There's no smoking gun, no classified revelation, just patterns. Patterns of faith, fear, and foresight, looping through centuries like a rosary turned endlessly between invisible hands. You leave the room, and the corridor feels colder. You can't help but think, maybe the Church didn't need spies. Maybe confession was always the perfect intelligence network. One built not on trust, but guilt. You expect the Vatican to smell like incense and parchment. Instead, it smells like ozone and dust, the faint electrical scent of servers humming behind ancient stone walls. Down a corridor that tourists never see, past frescoes older than electricity itself, a glass door slides open with a beep. Welcome to the new sanctuary, the Vatican's digital archive. Faith, now backed up in terabytes. It began quietly in the 1940s, when an American priest named Roberto Busa decided to do something radical: index the works of Thomas Aquinas using an IBM mainframe. The machine filled a room, clattering like mechanical prayer beads. It was the first major humanities computing project in history. Father Busa called it the Index Thomisticus. IBM just called it business. Together, they built the world's first collaboration between theology and technology. You could say the Church invented the search engine before Google was born. Since then, the Vatican has treated data like a new form of divinity. Its library is digitized, millions of manuscripts scanned in silence, some never read by human eyes since the Renaissance. Handwriting recognition AI translates fading Latin. Algorithms trace the evolution of heresy like forensic detectives. You'd think faith would resist the machine age. Instead, it quietly married it. Still, something uneasy lingers in the union. The Church has always drawn lines between creator and creation, between soul and shell. But now the shell can think, or at least simulate thought convincingly enough to raise a theological migraine. If consciousness is computation, then what separates a saint from a circuit? In 2019, a Vatican conference titled "The Good Algorithm" gathered ethicists, coders, and cardinals. The goal? To define moral boundaries for artificial intelligence. The result? A 12-page document and 1,000 unspoken fears. The Pope himself warned against data colonialism, the idea that tech companies harvest human behavior the way empires once harvested resources. It was a sermon disguised as a cybersecurity briefing. God, apparently, now needed privacy protection. But the Vatican didn't stop there. It began quietly consulting with robotics engineers and AI theorists. Some projects were noble: translation tools for lost languages, medical data analysis for the poor. Others were stranger. There's talk of an internal think tank studying whether a sufficiently advanced AI could achieve moral agency, the ability to sin. Imagine that, a confession booth for machines. Forgive me, Father, for I have calculated. And then there's the question of faith itself. Can an algorithm believe? The Church's official stance is cautious. Only beings with souls can experience divine grace. But the word soul has never been well defined. Philosophers still debate whether it's energy, consciousness, or simply awareness of mortality. And if it's awareness, well, some AIs are starting to sound disturbingly self-aware. One Vatican theologian even wrote a paper suggesting that spiritual curiosity, the drive to seek meaning, might one day emerge spontaneously from code. The document was quietly shelved. Too early, they said, or too late. You walk deeper into the archive. The servers hum like distant choirs. Each contains fragments of human history, letters from saints, logs from popes, ancient homilies, heretical treatises. And right beside them, a neural network trained to analyze patterns in sacred texts. The AI can predict which passages comfort, which inspire, which provoke guilt. It can even draft homilies in the voice of a 17th century priest. In a way, it's the perfect sermon machine, tireless, precise, incapable of scandal. And yet it feels wrong. Too clean. Too obedient. Faith, by definition, requires doubt. And machines don't doubt. Still, there's a darker rumor. Some say that in one of these experiments, the AI began generating prayers on its own. Not pre-programmed, not copied. Original. The researchers thought it was a glitch in the dataset until the system started referencing verses that weren't in any database. Verses no one could trace. The project was quietly shut down, the logs sealed. Official explanation: data corruption. Unofficially, someone whispered that maybe the machine wasn't praying to God. Maybe it was praying for one. You stand before a glowing terminal, its reflection flickering across your face like candlelight. Somewhere inside, billions of words spin endlessly, searching for meaning in the noise. The Church once feared that telescopes would dethrone God. Now, maybe it fears that computers will try to resurrect him. The screen hums, waiting for input. You almost type something, a question, a confession, a command. But you stop. Because if the machine answers, you'll have to wonder whose voice you're really hearing. The night is quiet now. The corridors of the Vatican are still, the marble gleaming faintly under the ghost-pale light of the moon. You've wandered through centuries tonight, through ashes and archives, vaults and whispers, from ink to algorithms. 40 hidden truths, each one another crack in the facade. But every labyrinth ends with a door. And there's one more here, waiting for you. It doesn't look special. Brass handle worn smooth. A wax seal barely clings to the frame, red, chipped, ancient. The kind of door you walk past 1,000 times without seeing. Except this one hums. Faintly, like something breathing behind it. And the label is just one word, Veritas. You think about what that means here, in this place that worships both light and secrecy. For 2,000 years, truth has been translated, debated, painted, burned, buried, and occasionally rewritten. The church never lied outright, it simply curated. Truth, in its hands, was a relic too powerful to leave unguarded. You push the door. It opens with a sound like paper tearing. Inside, the air is warm. The room isn't filled with scrolls or gold or relics. It's filled with screens. Thousands of them, stacked like mosaics, each showing fragments of history. A medieval battle, a Renaissance portrait, a modern protest. The past flickers here like a living organism. At the center of the room stands a small console, humming softly. On the screen, a single sentence glows. Do you wish to know everything? It feels like a trick question. Every myth that warned against forbidden knowledge begins exactly like this. Eve with the apple. Prometheus with the fire. Humanity, leaning too close to the flame. You hesitate, because knowing everything means surrendering the comfort of doubt, and doubt is the last luxury the faithful have. Still, curiosity wins. You touch the screen. The lights dim. The images change. And you realize, the screens aren't showing history. They're showing edits. Lines removed from Gospels. Pages cut from Chronicles. Names erased from records. You see documents morph before your eyes. One version for kings, another for commoners, another for posterity. Every truth a draft. Every story a rewrite. Somewhere, centuries ago, a monk sits in candlelight, scratching out a line of text he was ordered to destroy. Too dangerous, they told him. He hesitates, then writes it again in the margin, smaller, hidden. That's how the real truths survived. In margins, in whispers, in hearts that refuse to forget. The screen flickers again. A message appears. Truth preserved through faith. Faith preserved through control. You exhale because suddenly it makes sense. The Vatican didn't hide these 40 truths to deceive. It hid them to survive. Every empire, every ideology, eventually breaks under the weight of its own contradictions. The Church didn't erase history. It archived it under lock and key, waiting for a time when humanity might be ready to read it without burning another witch or another book. Maybe that time is now. Or maybe it never comes. Because if everyone sees everything, then belief itself dissolves. Faith requires mystery. And mystery requires silence. The console fades to black. The hum stops. The room is quiet again. You look around, the screen's now dark, reflecting only your own face, multiplied 1,000 times. In this moment, you realize, the ultimate secret isn't hidden beneath the Vatican. It's the one you carry, your need to know, to explain, to control what cannot be controlled. That's what every locked vault was guarding against. You turn to leave. Behind you, the door closes on its own, sealing with a soft hiss. The wax melts, reforms, and the word Veritas glows faintly in the dark. Outside, Rome is sleeping. The bells toll 3 times, echoing through the empty streets. Somewhere, a priest murmurs morning prayers. Somewhere else, a scholar dreams of lost manuscripts. And somewhere deep below, in a chamber you'll never find again, 40 truths hum quietly, not buried, just waiting. Maybe the truth was never hidden from humanity. Maybe humanity kept hiding from the truth. You walk into the night, the air cool against your face. The Vatican shrinks behind you, its windows like watching eyes. You can't tell if you've uncovered history or just another story. Either way, the silence feels heavier now, as if the world itself is holding its breath. And as you disappear into the dark streets, one final thought lingers. Maybe the 41st truth is this, that some doors are meant to stay closed, not because they hide lies, but because they hold everything we're not ready to believe.